Imagine standing in a vast library in 1770, pulling out a map of the world. As your eyes sweep across Europe, China, India, you notice something strange. Between them lies an enormous territory, labeled simply Tartaria, an empire so vast it stretches from the Caspian Sea to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. Yet today, most people have never heard its name. Was Tartaria real? The maps say yes. History books say it's complicated. Tonight, we're going on a journey into one of history's most intriguing mysteries. Not to push conspiracy theories, but to explore a fascinating what-if question. What if Tartaria had been a unified empire? What would that world have looked like? Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, deep-dive history like this, you can tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next bedtime journey. And if you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now for you? So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step back in time to an empire that exists somewhere between history and imagination. Chapter 1: The Maps That Sparked a Mystery. Our story begins not in the dusty halls of ancient palaces, but in the workshops of European cartographers during the Renaissance. These mapmakers faced an enormous challenge: how to represent a world that was still largely unknown to them. In the year 1570, a Flemish cartographer named Abraham Ortelius published something revolutionary, the first modern atlas, called Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, which means Theatre of the World. Within its pages lay a map that would puzzle historians for centuries to come. It showed a massive territory labelled Tartariae Civ Magni, Chami Regni, Tartaria, or the Kingdom of the Great Cham. The map depicted an empire of staggering proportions. Its western border touched the Volga River and the Caspian Sea, where European traders had some contact with the peoples there. To the east, it stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing lands that Europeans had barely glimpsed. From the frozen shores of the Arctic in the north, it swept southward to the borders of Persia, India, and the Great Wall of China. On Ortelius's map, in the heart of this vast Tartaria, sat an illustration, a great ruler seated in a tent, surrounded by courtiers. This was the Great Cham, the Khan, a title that echoed the mighty Genghis Khan who had lived centuries before. The image suggested power, organization, unity. It suggested an empire. But Ortelius was just the beginning. Over the next 2.5 centuries, map after map produced in Europe would feature Tartaria. Each cartographer seemed to confirm what the others had drawn. In 1657, Dutch mapmaker Nicolaes Vischer created his new and accurate map of all Asia, and there again sprawled Tartaria, dominating the northern and central portions of the continent. French maps showed it. English maps showed it. German maps showed it. The name appeared so consistently, on so many maps, that it seemed beyond question. There was a place called Tartaria, and it was enormous. The sheer consistency is striking when you examine these historical documents. Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, virtually every major European atlas included Tartaria. The mapmakers were using the best information available to them, compiling reports from traders, missionaries, and the occasional adventurer who had ventured into these distant lands. And all of them, working independently across different countries and decades, kept drawing this massive territory and labeling it Tartaria. What's particularly fascinating is how the representation evolved over time. Early maps showed Tartaria as one massive, undifferentiated region. But as European knowledge slowly improved, cartographers began to subdivide it. By the 1700s, you'd see labels like Russian Tartary in the west, Chinese Tartary in the east, independent Tartary in the center, and Little Tartary near the Black Sea. They were trying to make sense of the vastness, to organize it into comprehensible pieces. Yet even with these subdivisions, what the maps didn't show was equally revealing. There were no clear borders between these Tartaries, no capital cities marked with the prominence you'd expect from a unified empire, no detailed political divisions or provincial boundaries. Instead, Tartaria appeared as a great blanket term covering an enormous swath of territory about which Europeans knew very little. The name itself offers us a clue to this mystery. Tartaria comes from Tartar, a term Europeans used to describe the peoples of Central Asia and the Eurasian steppe. But where did Tartar come from? The word has murky origins, possibly derived from Tartar, which referred to a confederation of Mongolic and Turkic tribes that had been part of Genghis Khan's forces. Here's where it gets interesting. Some scholars suggest Europeans deliberately modified Tartar to Tartar because it reminded them of Tartarus, the ancient Greek name for the underworld, a place of darkness and chaos. Whether this was intentional or not, the association reveals something about European perceptions. In medieval and early modern Europe, the peoples of the steppes were viewed with a mixture of fear and fascination. And there was good reason for that fear. These were the descendants of the Mongol hordes that had swept into Europe in the 1200s under Genghis Khan and his successors. They had conquered kingdoms, burned cities, and inspired terror from Hungary to the gates of Vienna. An army of mounted warriors had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, moved with impossible speed, and crushed every force sent against them. Then, just as suddenly, they had withdrawn, leaving traumatized populations and legends that would last for centuries. The word Tartar in European languages carried all these connotations: the exotic, the dangerous, the unknown, the terrifying. When mapmakers wrote Tartaria across their maps, they were essentially labeling a vast region they didn't fully understand, a region inhabited by numerous peoples who rode horses, lived in tents or distant cities, and seemed to Europeans to be constantly at war. Travel accounts from European adventurers added layers to the mystery. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who travelled to the court of Kublai Khan in the late 1200s, wrote extensively about his journey through territories controlled by Mongol rulers. His accounts were filled with wonders: vast herds of horses, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, mobile tent cities that could be packed up and moved in hours, fierce warriors who could shoot arrows accurately while riding at full gallop, and courts of incredible wealth where silk and gold were commonplace. Later travellers added their own observations. In the 1300s, Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan explorer, travelled through the territories of the Golden Horde and described the organization of the Mongol postal system, the lavish hospitality of the Khans, and the diverse peoples living under Mongol rule. In the 1600s, European Jesuits travelled to Beijing and sent back reports about the regions they crossed. Each account added details, but also added to the sense that these were lands of mystery and marvel. The thing is, these travellers were describing real places and real peoples. The lands they crossed were indeed vast and impressive. The kingdoms they visited did exist. The wealth they witnessed was genuine. But they existed as a collection of separate khanates, tribal confederations, and regional powers, not as a single, unified empire called Tartaria. By the 1700s, some European scholars were beginning to realize this. They understood that Tartaria was more of a geographical convenience than a political reality. The French Encyclopédie, that great Enlightenment project to catalogue all human knowledge, included an entry on Tartary that acknowledged it wasn't really a unified country, but rather a term for the vast territories between Europe and China, inhabited by numerous different peoples. But despite this growing understanding among scholars, the name persisted on maps. It had such staying power, appeared on so many authoritative atlases, that cartographers continued to use it even as their knowledge improved. It was familiar. It was convenient. And in an age when much of the world was still being mapped and explored, having a name for a vast region was useful, even if that name didn't correspond to any actual political entity. The persistence of Tartaria on maps tells us something important about how geographical knowledge develops. Mapmakers don't start with perfect information. They compile what they know, fill in gaps with educated guesses, and gradually refine their work as new information arrives. In the case of Tartaria, the refinement took centuries. The name served a purpose. It gave Europeans a way to refer to and think about a region that was far away, difficult to reach, and inhabited by peoples whose languages and customs were largely unknown. Only in the 1800s did Tartaria finally begin to disappear from maps. This happened for several reasons. Russian expansion eastward and southward meant much better information about Siberia and Central Asia. The Russian Empire was systematically conquering and surveying these territories, replacing vague notions with detailed geographical knowledge. British expansion from India northward provided better information about the southern edges of what had been labelled Tartary. And the Qing dynasty in China was expanding westward, into Mongolia and Xinjiang, bringing those regions into clearer focus. As knowledge improved, the blanket term Tartaria broke down. The regions it had encompassed were given more specific names reflecting actual political realities: the Russian Empire's Siberian territories, the Qing dynasty's western provinces, independent khanates in Central Asia that would soon fall to Russian conquest. By the mid-1800s, Tartaria existed only on outdated maps, a cartographic ghost gradually fading away. But the name lingered in books, in older maps still in circulation, in the European imagination. This vast territory between Europe and China, this land of horsemen and deserts and endless steppes, kept a certain mystique. It represented the unknown, the exotic, the last great unconquered spaces before the age of European colonial dominance covered the globe with precise surveys and clear borders. So we're left with a paradox. Tartaria was real in the sense that the word appeared on genuine historical maps for over 2 centuries and referred to actual territories inhabited by real peoples. But it wasn't real in the sense of being a unified empire with a central government, a single ruler, or a shared national identity. It was a European conception, an outsider's label, a convenient fiction that served a purpose until better knowledge made it obsolete. This is the mystery that has captivated imaginations. When people today look at these old maps and see this enormous territory labeled Tartaria, spanning nearly half of Asia, it's natural to wonder, was there something more? Could there have been a great empire that somehow got lost in the historical record? Did something exist that left so little trace? We barely remember it. And that's the question we're going to explore tonight. Not as a claim that such an empire really existed and was hidden, but as a thought experiment in alternative history. What if Tartaria had been real? Not just a name on a map, but an actual unified empire that lasted for centuries. What would that have looked like? How would it have functioned? And why might it have fallen, leaving barely a trace? To answer these questions, we first need to understand what really existed in these territories during the centuries when Tartaria appeared on maps. We need to look at the actual history, the real kingdoms, the actual peoples, the genuine political structures, before we can imagine the alternative. Because good alternative history doesn't ignore reality, it builds on reality, asking how small changes might have created different outcomes. So let's turn to what we know actually happened in the lands that European maps labeled Tartaria. Let's look at the real history before we imagine what might have been. Chapter 2. The Historical Reality. To understand what Tartaria could have been, we first need to understand what actually existed in those vast territories that European mapmakers labelled with that mysterious name. The reality is both more complex and more fascinating than a simple unified empire. Let's start with the geography, because geography shapes everything: where people can live, how they make their living, what kind of societies they can build. The lands marked as Tartaria on those old maps encompassed an enormous variety of terrain and climate zones. In the west, you had the grasslands north of the Black Sea and the Caspian, regions of rolling steppes where grass grew tall enough to hide a rider on horseback. These were the territories that would later become southern Russia and Ukraine. The soil was rich, the grass was abundant, and for thousands of years, these steppes had been home to nomadic peoples who measured their wealth in horses and herds. Moving east, you'd cross the Ural Mountains, that ancient chain that Europeans considered the dividing line between their continent and Asia. The Urals weren't particularly high. They'd been worn down by hundreds of millions of years of erosion, but they marked a clear transition. Beyond them stretched Siberia. Siberia. Even the name conjures images of endless forests and brutal winters. And those images aren't wrong, but they're incomplete. Siberia wasn't empty wasteland. It was home to numerous indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years. Hunters and fishermen along the great rivers, reindeer herders in the far north, trappers who understood how to survive in one of Earth's harshest environments. The taiga forests, that great belt of coniferous trees that stretches across northern Asia, seemed to go on forever, broken only by massive rivers like the Ob, the Yenisei, and the Lena, all flowing north toward the Arctic Ocean. Further south lay what Europeans really imagined when they thought of Tartary, the great steppes of Central Asia. These grasslands were different from the forests of Siberia or even the western steppes. They were open, windswept, and seemed to stretch to infinity under enormous skies. This was horse country, where grass-fed herds could roam for hundreds of miles without encountering significant obstacles. The steppes had been the homeland of nomadic peoples for thousands of years. Cultures that lived in felt tents, followed their animals with the seasons, and occasionally exploded outward in waves of conquest that reshaped entire continents. Even further south, the landscape transformed yet again. The steppes gave way to deserts and mountains. The Taklamakan Desert, the Karakum, the Kizilkum, the vast seas of sand where water was scarce and survival required intimate knowledge of where the oases lay. These deserts weren't completely impassable, though. For thousands of years, caravans had been crossing them, following routes that connected the rare oases where water could be found. And at those oases, cities had grown. Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, Merv, names that echo with history. These weren't primitive settlements. They were sophisticated urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, sometimes more. They had universities where scholars studied astronomy and mathematics. They had libraries preserving knowledge from across the Islamic world. They had workshops producing textiles, metalwork, and ceramics that were prized across Asia and beyond. These were the jewels of the Silk Road, places where caravans stopped to rest and trade goods traveling between China and the Mediterranean. The mountains of Central Asia, the Tian Shan, the Pamirs, ranges so high they were called the roof of the world, contained their own riches. Minerals in the rocks, timber on the lower slopes, and most importantly, water. The snowmelt from these mountains fed the rivers that made agriculture possible in an otherwise arid region. To the east, the terrain shifted again. Manchuria offered rich agricultural lands, forests, and access to the Pacific Ocean. Mongolia remained largely steppe and desert, but it held a special place in the history of this entire region. This was the homeland of the man whose conquests in the early 1200s had created the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen. Genghis Khan. Even today, 8 centuries after his death, the name carries weight. He was born around 1162, in a time when Mongolia was divided among competing tribes that spent as much time fighting each other as they did surviving the harsh environment. His early life was marked by hardship. His father was poisoned when he was young, leaving his family destitute. But through a combination of charisma, tactical genius, ruthlessness, and an ability to inspire loyalty, he united the Mongol tribes by 1206. What happened next changed the world. Genghis Khan didn't just create an army. He created a military machine more effective than anything that had existed before. His forces were built around horse archers, warriors who could shoot accurately while riding at full gallop. They were organized with mathematical precision into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. They used sophisticated intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and tactical innovations that bewildered their enemies. Between 1206 and his death in 1227, Genghis Khan conquered an empire that stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea. He destroyed the powerful Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia. He conquered northern China. He sent armies into Russia and Eastern Europe that defeated every force sent against them. By the time he died, he controlled territory that contained perhaps a quarter of the world's population. But here's what's crucial to understand. Even at its height under Genghis Khan, this empire was being prepared for division. Mongol tradition dictated that a father's property should be divided among his sons. Genghis Khan allocated different regions to his 4 sons from his principal wife. The eldest, Jochi, received the western territories. The second son, Chagatai, got Central Asia. The third son, Ogedai, became the Great Khan and held Mongolia and northern China. The youngest, Tolui, received the Mongol heartland as the guardian of the ancestral lands. This system worked, after a fashion, as long as there was a strong Great Khan who could command the loyalty of his relatives. Ogedai, who succeeded his father, managed to hold things together and even expand the empire further. Under his rule, the Mongols completed the conquest of northern China, pushed deeper into Russia and Eastern Europe, and reached the gates of Vienna before turning back. But when Ogedai died in 1241, the system began to crack. There was a power struggle over succession. Different branches of the family supported different candidates. It took several years to resolve, and even then, the resolution was temporary. When Mongol Khan died in 1259 while campaigning in China, the empire effectively split. Mongol's brother Kublai declared himself Great Khan and focused on completing the conquest of China. He founded the Yuan dynasty and made Beijing his capital. He became, for all practical purposes, a Chinese emperor, albeit one from a nomadic background. His court adopted Chinese customs. His administration used Chinese bureaucratic systems. The Mongol character remained. The ruling class was still Mongol and allied Turkic peoples, but increasingly, the Yuan dynasty looked and functioned like a Chinese dynasty. Meanwhile, another of Mongol's brothers, Arik Boka, contested Kublai's claim to be Great Khan. Although Arik Boka eventually lost, the civil war between them weakened the unity of the empire. The Western territories, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, increasingly acted independently. They still acknowledged a nominal Great Khan, but in practice, they were separate states. By 1300, the Mongol Empire as a unified entity was essentially over. It had lasted less than a century in any meaningful sense. What remained were four major successor states, each going its own way. The Golden Horde controlled the western steppes and held dominion over the Russian principalities, extracting tribute but largely allowing them to govern themselves. The Golden Horde grew wealthy from controlling trade routes and from the tribute they collected. They gradually converted to Islam and intermarried with Turkic peoples, becoming as much Turkic as Mongol in character. The Ilkhanate ruled Persia and the surrounding regions. They too converted to Islam and became patrons of Persian culture, commissioning magnificent architecture and supporting scholars and artists. The Ilkhanate collapsed in the 1340s, fragmenting into numerous smaller states that fought among themselves. The Chagatai Khanate held Central Asia, but it too was unstable. It split into eastern and western portions, and control over the Great Silk Road cities shifted repeatedly between different claimants. In the late 1300s, a new conqueror arose from this region, Timur, known in Europe as Tamerlane. He claimed descent from Genghis Khan and created his own vast empire, but it was his personal creation and fragmented after his death in 1405. The Yuan dynasty in China lasted until 1368, when Chinese rebels finally overthrew it and established the Ming dynasty. The Mongol ruling class was expelled, retreating to Mongolia. There, they continued to claim the title of Great Khan, but their power was a shadow of what it had been. Mongolia itself fragmented into competing groups, and for the next several centuries, Mongol power was limited primarily to raiding China's northern border. So by the time European mapmakers began drawing maps showing Tartaria in the 1500s, the reality on the ground was one of tremendous fragmentation. Where there had once been a unified empire, now there were dozens of separate political entities. The Golden Horde itself had broken up by the late 1400s. In its place were multiple khanates, the Kazan Khanate along the Volga River, the Astrakhan Khanate at the mouth of the Volga where it flows into the Caspian Sea, the Crimean Khanate on the Black Sea Peninsula, the Siberian Khanate beyond the Urals, and others. Each was independent, often fighting the others, sometimes allying with outside powers like the Grand Duchy of Moscow or the Ottoman Empire. Central Asia was divided among various Uzbek Khanates and other successor states. The cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Khiva became capitals of their own Khanates, rivals competing for trade and territory. The rulers claimed descent from Genghis Khan or Timur to legitimize their authority, but this didn't create unity. If anything, it gave multiple rulers claims to be the rightful heir of past glory. Siberia remained largely outside these conflicts, inhabited by indigenous peoples organized into small tribal groups. They lived by hunting, fishing, and reindeer herding, following patterns of life that had existed for thousands of years. They weren't united under any large political structure. When Russian Cossacks began pushing into Siberia in the late 1500s, they encountered these peoples but found no unified state to conquer. Mongolia itself had fallen into what historians call the Northern Yuan period. The descendants of the Yuan dynasty Khans still claimed authority, but Mongolia was poor and divided. Different tribal groups followed their own leaders. There were periodic attempts to reunite the Mongols, most notably by Dayan Khan in the late 1400s and early 1500s, but these unifications were temporary. Without the vast tribute from conquered territories that had enriched Genghis Khan's empire, Mongolia couldn't sustain a large centralized state. Manchuria, the forested and agricultural region northeast of China, was home to the Jurchen peoples. They were semi-nomadic, living between the Chinese agricultural world and the nomadic steppe, borrowing from both. They had their own kingdoms and tribal confederations. Eventually, in the 1640s, united Jurchen forces, calling themselves Manchus, would conquer China and establish the Qing dynasty. But during most of the period when Tartaria appeared on European maps, Manchuria was a patchwork of competing groups. This was the reality, not an empire, but a mosaic of peoples, states, and cultures occupying some of the most diverse territory on Earth, a region that had once been united under Mongol rule but had long since fragmented. A place of tremendous cultural richness, military traditions that had conquered half the known world, and economic importance as the heart of Silk Road trade, but without the political unity that the term empire implies. What about the people themselves? The indigenous populations of these regions were incredibly diverse. There were Mongolic peoples, Mongols proper in Mongolia, Buryats around Lake Baikal, Kalmyks on the western steppes. There were Turkic peoples, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Tatars, Uyghurs, and dozens of others, spread across the steppes and Central Asian cities. There were Tungusic peoples in Manchuria and eastern Siberia. There were countless indigenous Siberian groups, each with their own language and culture. There were settled Persian-speaking populations in the cities of Central Asia. There were Russian Slavs gradually expanding eastward. These peoples had different languages, though many were related within larger language families. They had different religions. Islam dominated in Central Asia, Buddhism had strong influence among Mongols, and in Tibet, Christianity existed among some groups, and shamanic traditions remained widespread, especially in Siberia. They had different ways of life. Some were nomadic herders, some were settled farmers, some were urban craftsmen and merchants, some were hunters in the forests. What they didn't have was a unifying political structure or even a common identity. If you had travelled across this region in 1600 and asked people what country they belonged to, you would have gotten many different answers. A person in Bukhara might have identified with their city and the Khan who ruled it. A Kazakh nomad would have identified with their particular horde or clan. A Siberian Yakut wouldn't have thought in terms of states at all, but rather in terms of kinship groups and traditional territories. The term Tartaria, as Europeans used it, would have been meaningless to these people. It was an outsider's label, a way for Europeans to refer to regions they didn't understand, peoples whose names they often didn't know, and political structures that were too complex or unfamiliar to easily categorize. Trade networks provided one form of connection across these territories. The Silk Road had been linking east and west for over 1,000 years. Caravans knew the routes, knew which tribes controlled which territories, knew how to negotiate safe passage. A merchant from Bukhara might travel to Beijing over the course of months, stopping at caravanserayas along the way, exchanging goods at various markets. But this commercial network didn't require or create a unified empire. If anything, trade flourished best when there were multiple small states competing for the revenue from taxing caravans passing through their territories. Another unifying factor was the prestige of Mongol descent. Across these territories, rulers claimed legitimacy through their lineage from Genghis Khan. Even leaders who had no actual blood connection would create or claim genealogies connecting themselves to the great conqueror. This created a kind of cultural commonwealth, a shared historical memory, and a common set of political ideals based on Mongol tradition. But this cultural unity didn't translate to political unity. If anything, multiple rulers claiming to be the true heir of Genghis Khan meant competition and conflict rather than cooperation. By the 1700s, the situation was changing rapidly. Russia was expanding eastward with systematic determination. Russian forces had crossed the Urals in the late 1500s and by the mid-1600s had reached the Pacific Ocean. The whole of Siberia was gradually being incorporated into the Russian Empire. The process wasn't always violent. Often it involved treaties with local peoples, establishment of trading posts, and collection of tribute in furs. But the result was the same. Territories that European maps had labeled as part of Tartaria were becoming part of Russia. In the east, the Qing dynasty that had conquered China in 1644 was expanding westward. The Qing incorporated Mongolia through a combination of alliance and conquest in the late 1600s. They pushed into Xinjiang in the 1700s, bringing the western territories under Chinese control. Again, lands that had been Tartaria on maps were being absorbed into a different empire. In Central Asia, the Khanates remained independent longer, but they were weakening. The shift in global trade patterns hurt them, as European ships found ways to reach Asia by sailing around Africa. The overland Silk Road became less important. The revenue that had sustained the great cities declined. By the 1800s, these Khanates were caught between Russian expansion from the north and British influence pushing up from India. The Great Game, the competition between the Russian and British empires for control of Central Asia, would ultimately result in Russian conquest of most of the region by the late 1800s. So, by the time the term Tartaria finally disappeared from maps in the mid to late 1800s, the territories it had encompassed were being divided among expanding empires: Russia, China, and British influence from India. The independent Khanates that had once ruled these regions were gone, or were shadows of their former selves, soon to be absorbed. This is the historical reality we're working with. Not an empire that fell mysteriously, leaving no trace, but a region that was never unified in the first place, at least not for long. A mosaic of peoples and states that briefly came under Mongol rule in the 1200s, then fragmented, then were gradually absorbed by expanding neighboring powers over several centuries. A place of tremendous historical importance, rich cultures, and fascinating stories, but not the unified Tartarian Empire that conspiracy theories imagine. Now, with this foundation firmly established, we can ask our central question: what if things had been different? What if, instead of fragmenting after Genghis Khan's death, the Mongol Empire had found a way to hold together? What if the lands that Europeans labeled Tartaria had actually been unified under a single authority for centuries? That's the alternative history we're about to explore, building on what was real to imagine what might have been. Chapter 3: Entering the What If, the Hypothetical Scenario. Now we step across a threshold. Everything we've discussed so far has been grounded in historical fact. The maps were real, the territories existed, the fragmented Khanates were genuine political entities. But from this point forward, we're entering the realm of imagination, of alternative history, of what if. This is important to understand clearly. We're not claiming that a unified Tartarian Empire existed and was somehow hidden from history books. We're not promoting conspiracy theories about lost civilizations with advanced technology. Instead, we're engaging in a thoughtful exercise, taking the real elements that existed, the peoples, the territories, the resources, the cultural traditions, and asking how they might have combined differently under different circumstances. Think of it as historical fiction, grounded in historical fact. Everything we're about to explore will be based on what was actually possible with the technology, knowledge, and social structures of the time. We're not going to invoke mysterious powers or impossible achievements. We're simply going to imagine a different path that history might have taken if a few key decisions had been made differently. So let's establish the premise of our thought experiment clearly. What if, in the decades following Genghis Khan's death in 1227, instead of fragmenting into competing Khanates, the Mongol Empire had found a way to maintain unity? What if a succession system had been established that prevented the civil wars that actually tore the empire apart? What if the vast territories from Eastern Europe to the Pacific had remained under a single, coordinated authority, not just for decades, but for centuries? This isn't as far-fetched as it might initially seem. The Mongol Empire came remarkably close to achieving lasting unity. For several decades in the mid-1200s, it functioned as a unified entity more effectively than any empire of comparable size before or since. The Great Khan in Karakoram could send orders that would be obeyed in Russia, Persia, and China. The famous YAM system, that network of postal stations with relay riders, could carry messages across the empire faster than any other communication system in the medieval world. A merchant carrying a Mongol passport could travel from the Black Sea to Beijing under the protection of a single authority, with standardized laws and expectations at every stop. The empire had all the infrastructure for unity. It had a military system that worked brilliantly. It had administrative practices that could govern diverse populations. It had economic policies that encouraged trade and generated revenue. What it lacked was the one crucial element, a succession system that could survive the death of strong rulers without descending into civil war. This was the empire's fatal flaw. When Genghis Khan died, his empire was divided among his sons according to Mongol tradition. When Urgedai Khan died, conflict erupted over who should succeed him. When Mongol Khan died in 1259, the empire effectively split as different factions backed different claimants. Each succession crisis weakened the bonds holding the empire together until finally those bonds snapped. So our first what if is this. What if the Mongols had adopted a clear, undisputed succession system? Perhaps something like primogeniture, the eldest son automatically inherits, as European kingdoms practiced. Or perhaps a stronger, more formalized version of their Kurultai system, where assemblies of nobles elected the Khan according to established rules that everyone accepted. Or perhaps a system where the great Khan appointed his successor during his lifetime, with that choice being binding. Any of these systems might have worked if implemented early enough and enforced consistently. The key would be removing ambiguity, because ambiguity invited competition, and competition among Mongol princes meant civil war. Let's place our divergence point, the moment where our alternative timeline splits from actual history, around the year 1300, as one century turned to the next. In actual history, the Mongol Empire was already fragmenting by this point. The Yuan dynasty in China was effectively independent. The Golden Horde in Russia did its own thing. The Ilkhanate in Persia was going its own way. The nominal position of Great Khan still existed, but it had little real authority outside of Mongolia and northern China. In our alternative timeline, let's imagine that around this time, a particularly capable Great Khan emerged, perhaps a grandson of Kublai Khan, with both political skill and military prestige. This Khan manages to bring the competing branches of the family together, perhaps through a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and carefully managed military victories that remind everyone of the benefits of unity. He implements a reformed succession system, perhaps establishing a council of the senior members of all branches of the royal family, who must unanimously approve each new Great Khan from a pool of qualified candidates. This system isn't perfect. No system is, but it's stable enough to prevent the worst civil wars. Disputes still happen, but they're resolved through negotiation and compromise rather than armies marching against each other. The empire remains unified, not through the will of one supreme ruler, but through a political structure that makes unity more beneficial than fragmentation. This hypothetical Tartarian Empire, let's adopt that European name for convenience, would inherit all the territories the Mongols had conquered. In the west, it would control the Russian principalities, extracting tribute but largely allowing them to maintain their own governance systems. The steppes, north of the Black Sea and Caspian, would be firmly under the Khan's authority, with Mongol and Turkic nobles holding land and commanding military forces. The wealthy cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Khiva, would be integrated into the empire. These cities were crucial because they sat on the Silk Road, and controlling them meant controlling the flow of trade between East and West. Their revenues would flow to the imperial treasury, funding the administration and military. Persia, that ancient land, with its sophisticated urban culture and rich agricultural base, would remain part of the empire. This was one of the wealthiest regions in the world, heir to thousands of years of civilization. Persian administrators, with their experience in running complex bureaucracies, would be essential to governing the empire. China, or at least northern China, would be under imperial control. The Yuan dynasty that Kublai Khan established would, in our timeline, remain integrated with the larger empire rather than becoming effectively independent. This is crucial because China was by far the most populous and in many ways the most advanced part of the empire. Chinese agricultural surplus, Chinese manufacturing, Chinese technology, all of these would be assets of the empire. Mongolia itself would be the heartland, the symbolic center from which the ruling dynasty originated. It would hold special status, with Mongol nobles maintaining their traditional privileges and ways of life even as they participated in governing a vast, settled empire. Manchuria would be controlled, providing valuable resources and access to the Pacific Ocean. And Siberia, that vast, sparsely populated region of forests and tundra, would be gradually incorporated, valued primarily for its furs, but also as territory that should be controlled to prevent rivals from taking it. Let's pause to grasp the scale of what we're imagining. From the empire's western border, somewhere along the Dnieper River, to its eastern shore on the Pacific Ocean, would be roughly 6,000 miles. From the Arctic coast of Siberia to the northern borders of India would be another 3,000 miles or more. This empire would encompass approximately 12 million square miles of connected territory. To put that in perspective, the Roman Empire at its height covered about 2.5 million square miles. The British Empire at its largest in the early 1900s controlled about 13 million square miles, but that was scattered across every continent, not contiguous. Our hypothetical Tartaria would be the largest contiguous land empire in human history, which, ironically, the actual Mongol Empire briefly was before it fragmented. The population would be enormous by medieval standards. China alone might hold 60 to 80 million people. Central Asia perhaps 10 to 15 million. Persia 5 to 10 million. The Russian territories 6 to 8 million. Siberia and Mongolia, being sparsely populated, maybe 2 to 3 million combined. We're looking at an empire with roughly 80 to 100 million subjects, making it by far the most populous state in the world during the 14 and 1500s. But numbers only tell part of the story. The real question is, how would such an empire actually function? What would hold it together across such vast distances and such tremendous diversity? The challenges would be immense. This empire would contain an extraordinary variety of peoples, languages, religions, and cultures. In the West, Orthodox Christian Russians and Slavic peoples. In Central Asia, Turkic-speaking Muslims with urban sophistication. In Persia, Persian-speaking Muslims with thousands of years of imperial tradition. In China, a civilization that considered itself the center of the world with advanced bureaucracy and Confucian philosophy. In Mongolia, the traditional nomadic culture of the ruling dynasty. In Siberia, dozens of indigenous peoples with shamanic traditions. How do you create unity from such diversity? The terrain presented another enormous challenge. How do you govern an empire that includes frozen tundra where temperatures drop to -50 degrees, endless forests where travel is difficult, except along rivers, vast steppes where there are no roads, harsh deserts where water is scarce, and fertile river valleys supporting dense populations? How do you maintain authority when it might take months for a message to travel from the capital to distant frontiers? Our Tartarian Empire would need to build on solutions the Mongols had already developed, but strengthen and systematize them. The Yam postal system would be expanded and maintained as a permanent institution. These postal stations, placed every 20 to 30 miles along major routes, would have fresh horses, supplies, and facilities for messengers. An imperial courier carrying the Khan's seal could requisition horses and ride at speed, covering perhaps 100 miles in a day by constantly changing mounts. This would allow messages to cross the empire in weeks rather than months, but still slow by modern standards, but remarkably fast for the medieval world. Regional administration would be crucial. The empire would need to be divided into major regions, each governed by a Khan or governor who held significant local authority but remained ultimately subordinate to the Great Khan. Perhaps a Khan for the Western territories, based at a major city on the Volga River. Another for Central Asia, based at Samarkand. One for the Eastern territories in Beijing. One for Persia, based at Tabriz. These regional rulers would typically be members of the royal family or trusted generals, holding power but owing allegiance to the center. Below them would be local administrators, and here's where the Mongols showed their genius. They often used local people to administer local territories. You couldn't govern China without Chinese bureaucrats who understood the complex systems of land ownership, taxation, and water management. You couldn't administer Persian cities without Persian officials who knew the local power structures and traditions. Our Tartarian Empire would continue this collaborative approach, with the Mongol ruling class sitting atop administrative systems that were largely staffed by local people who knew how things actually worked. Religious tolerance would be essential. The Mongols had practiced a pragmatic tolerance, not because they believed in religious freedom as a principle, but because trying to force religious uniformity across such a diverse empire would be impossible and counterproductive. Our Tartarian Empire would continue this policy. The Great Khan might personally follow Tengri, the traditional sky god of the Mongols, or might convert to Buddhism as many Mongol rulers did, or even to Islam given its dominance in Central Asia. But whatever the Khan's personal faith, smart governance would mean allowing Christians their churches, Muslims their mosques, Buddhists their monasteries, and local peoples their traditional practices. The military would be the ultimate guarantee of unity. The Mongol army had been devastatingly effective because of its organization, tactics, and the quality of its cavalry. Our Tartarian Empire would maintain this military tradition. Warriors would be drawn from across the empire. Mongol and Turkic cavalry would form the elite corps, but Chinese infantry and siege engineers, Persian cavalry, and others would all have roles. The decimal system of organization, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, would create clear chains of command. Regular training and periodic mobilizations would keep the army ready. But here's an important point. This army wouldn't just exist to fight external enemies. It would also serve as the enforcer of internal unity. Regional governors who became too ambitious would know that the Great Khan could send armies against them. Rebellious cities would know that resistance meant facing military force. The army's mere existence would discourage most challenges to central authority. Economic integration would help bind the empire together. The Silk Road would be the economic spine of the empire. By controlling virtually the entire route from China to the approaches to Europe, the empire could tax trade while ensuring the security that made merchants willing to undertake long journeys. This created a virtuous cycle. Secure routes meant more trade meant more tax revenue, more revenue meant the empire could afford to maintain security. The empire would also develop its own internal trade networks. Furs from Siberia would travel south. Silk from China would travel west. Horses from the steppes would be distributed across the empire. Persian carpets and metalwork would travel east and north. This internal commerce would create economic interdependence. Each region would benefit from being part of the empire because it gave them access to goods and markets they couldn't reach on their own. Cultural adaptation would be necessary but tricky. The historical Mongol rulers who lasted longest were those who adapted to local cultures while maintaining their identity. Kublai Khan adopted Chinese imperial customs but still identified as Mongol. Our Tartarian Empire would need to strike a similar balance across multiple cultures simultaneously. The Khan would need to be a Mongol warrior to maintain legitimacy with the steppe peoples, a patron of Islamic learning to maintain legitimacy in Central Asia and Persia, and an upholder of civilization to maintain legitimacy in China. This would require remarkable flexibility and probably different faces of authority presented in different regions. Let's establish a timeline for our hypothetical empire. It consolidates and stabilizes around 1300. Through the 1400s, it would be at its height, controlling trade routes, collecting tribute, maintaining relative peace across its territories, wealthy enough to build great monuments and support scholarship and the arts. The 1500s would bring new challenges. Gunpowder weapons would be changing warfare, making traditional cavalry less dominant. Maritime trade routes would be developing as European ships found ways to reach Asia, bypassing the Silk Road. Internal pressures would grow as regional identities strengthened and the practical benefits of unity became less obvious. The 1600s would see gradual decline. More succession disputes, more powerful regional governors, more difficulty maintaining control over distant territories. The 1700s would see the empire weakening significantly, losing territories to expanding neighbors like Russia and the Qing dynasty in China. By 1800, the empire might still exist on paper, but it would be fragmenting into the independent khanates that actually existed historically. By 1850, it would be completely dissolved. This gives us about 500 years of existence as a unified empire, roughly from 1300 to 1800. That's long enough to leave a significant mark on world history, to develop distinctive institutions and cultural achievements, but not so long that we have to imagine it surviving into the industrial age and modern era, which would strain credibility given the actual historical pressures these regions faced. Within this framework, we can now explore the details. What would daily life have been like in different parts of this empire? What would the cities have looked like? How would the economy have functioned? What cultural achievements might have emerged from such a unique blend of civilizations under a single political structure? These are the questions we'll explore in the remaining sections. We're building a detailed picture of something that never was, but could have been, taking the real elements of history and rearranging them into a different pattern, like creating a new image from the same colored glass in a kaleidoscope. And here's why this thought experiment matters. It helps us understand the actual history better. By imagining how the Mongol Empire might have survived, we better appreciate why it actually fell apart. By thinking through the challenges of governing such a vast, diverse territory, we understand the challenges all empires face. By exploring this alternative path, we see how contingent history is, how different decisions at key moments might have created a very different world. So let's continue our journey into this empire, between history and imagination. This Tartaria that existed on maps but might have existed in reality, this alternative past that illuminates both what was and what might have been. Chapter 4. Geography, the imperial capital. To understand how our hypothetical Tartarian Empire could have sustained itself for centuries, we need to examine the lands it controlled and the resources those lands offered. This wasn't barren wilderness. These were territories that had supported civilizations for thousands of years, each region with its own wealth and strategic value. Let's start in the west and work our way east, as if we were traveling across the empire ourselves, understanding what made each region valuable and how they fit together into an economic and political whole. The westernmost territories would be the lands north of the Black Sea and around the Caspian, regions that actual history knew as the domain of the Golden Horde. These were the steppes of what we now call Ukraine and southern Russia, vast grasslands that turned brilliant green in summer and became frozen plains in winter. This landscape might look empty to the untrained eye, but it was actually prime grazing land, capable of supporting enormous herds. The horses were crucial. In the medieval and early modern world, horses weren't just transportation, they were military power, wealth, and status all combined. The steppes could support hundreds of thousands of horses, and the peoples who lived here had been breeding them for millennia. These weren't the heavy war horses of European knights. They were smaller, tougher animals that could survive on grass alone, travel immense distances without tiring, and were born with temperaments suited for warfare. An empire built on Mongol military traditions would need a constant supply of these horses, and the western steppes provided exactly that. Beyond horses, there were cattle and sheep by the millions, providing meat, milk, leather, and wool. The region also controlled vital rivers. The Volga, Europe's longest river, flowed through these territories from north to south, emptying into the Caspian Sea. Cities along the Volga became wealthy trading centers because they sat at the crossroads where north-south trade met east-west routes. Goods from the Baltic, furs, amber, timber, could travel down the Volga. There they'd meet merchants coming from Persia and Central Asia with silks, spices, and manufactured goods. Control of the Volga meant control of this trade, and control of trade meant tax revenue flowing into imperial coffers. Moving east, we'd cross the Ural Mountains. These ancient, worn peaks weren't particularly high. Time had eroded them down, but they marked a clear boundary between the western steppes and Siberia. More importantly, they held mineral wealth. The Urals contained deposits of iron, copper, gold, silver, and precious stones. Mining these resources required technology and labor, but the potential was enormous. In actual history, Russian expansion into the Urals in the 1600s led to major mining operations that helped fuel Russian power. Our Tartarian Empire, controlling these territories centuries earlier, would have had access to this wealth to fund its military and administration. Beyond the Urals stretched Siberia, and here we need to adjust our thinking about what constitutes valuable territory. To European eyes, Siberia looked like worthless frozen wasteland. That assessment was profoundly wrong. First, there were the furs. The taiga, that great boreal forest stretching across northern Asia, was one of the richest fur-producing regions in the world. Sable, fox, ermine, beaver, and marten lived in these forests, and their pelts were luxury goods that commanded extraordinary prices. In medieval and early modern times, fine furs were symbols of wealth and status. A noble in Moscow, Istanbul, or London would pay a fortune for Siberian sable. The finest sable pelts were worth more than their weight in gold. Control of the Siberian fur trade would be like controlling oil fields in the modern era, a source of enormous wealth. The great Siberian rivers, the Ob, the Irtysh, the Yenisei, the Lena, were highways through the forest. They flowed north toward the Arctic Ocean, but more importantly, they provided access deep into the interior. In summer, boats could navigate them for hundreds of miles. In winter, when they froze solid, they became roads for sleds. Indigenous peoples had been using these rivers for trade and communication for thousands of years. A Tartarian empire would inherit and expand this river-based network, establishing trading posts and tribute collection points along the banks. Siberia also held other mineral wealth that wouldn't be fully exploited until much later, but showed signs even in earlier centuries. Gold could be panned from certain rivers. There were copper, lead, and tin deposits. Salt, essential for preserving food before refrigeration, could be extracted from certain locations. These weren't resources that would make Siberia wealthy on its own, but they were valuable supplements to the primary wealth of furs. The climate was harsh, certainly. Winter temperatures could drop to -50 degrees Fahrenheit or even colder. Summer brought swarms of mosquitoes so thick they could drive men and animals to madness. But indigenous peoples had lived here successfully for thousands of years. They understood which plants could be eaten, where animals migrated with the seasons, how to build shelters that could withstand months of darkness and cold. A Tartarian empire would need to work with these peoples, learning from their expertise and incorporating them into the imperial system through trade and tribute, rather than trying to impose alien systems that wouldn't work in this environment. Continuing south from Siberia, we reach the heartland steppes of Mongolia and Kazakhstan. This was homeland territory, where Genghis Khan had united the tribes and launched the conquests that created the empire. The Mongolian plateau was high, dry, and windswept. Rainfall was sparse, and agriculture was nearly impossible, except in a few favored valleys. Yet this seemingly barren landscape supported a way of life that had produced some of history's most formidable warriors. The secret was grass. Different types of grass grew at different elevations and in different seasons. Nomadic herders knew these patterns with the intimacy that farmers know their fields. They moved their herds, horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels, following the grass. In spring, they'd be in the lowlands where grass greened first. In summer, they'd move to higher elevations where the best pasture grew. In autumn, they'd descend again. In winter, they'd camp in sheltered valleys. This wasn't aimless wandering, but sophisticated resource management developed over thousands of years. The animals converted grass that humans couldn't eat into meat, milk, wool, and leather that sustained human life. Mongolia also had mineral resources. Gold and silver had been mined there since ancient times. The Mongols under Genghis Khan had used enslaved craftsmen from conquered territories to work these mines. There were copper deposits that could be worked with medieval technology. And strategically, Mongolia sat at a crossroads. Routes led south into China, west into Central Asia, north into Siberia, and east toward Manchuria and the Pacific. Control of Mongolia meant control of the center of our hypothetical empire, the place where the major regions met. Moving west from Mongolia into Central Asia proper, the landscape transformed into a complex patchwork of deserts and oases, mountains and river valleys. The great deserts, the Karakum, the Kizilkum, the Taklamakan, were formidable barriers. Summer temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Water was scarce. Sandstorms could bury caravans. But these deserts weren't impassable. For thousands of years, merchants had been crossing them following routes that connected the scattered oases. Those oasis settlements were jewels of civilization. Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, Merv, and dozens of smaller towns sat where rivers flowing from distant mountains created patches of fertility in the desert. These weren't primitive villages. They were sophisticated cities, some with populations approaching 100,000 or more. They had universities where scholars studied astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and Islamic law. They had libraries preserving knowledge from across the Islamic world and beyond. They manufactured textiles that were prized across Asia, metalwork of exceptional quality, ceramics, and glass. They were centers of art and culture, where poets composed verses in Persian that would be recited centuries later. The agricultural potential around these cities shouldn't be underestimated. Where irrigation could reach, fed by snowmelt from the mountains, the land was incredibly fertile. The climate was ideal for certain crops. Orchards produced apples, apricots, melons that were legendary for their sweetness, and grapes. Fields yielded wheat, barley, and cotton. The Fergana Valley in particular was famous for both its agriculture and its horses. A different breed from the steppe ponies, these were larger animals that Chinese emperors coveted and called heavenly horses. The mountains of Central Asia, the Tian Shan Range, the Pamirs, the Hindu Kush, held their own wealth. These ranges contained gold, silver, copper, lead, zinc, and precious stones, including lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone prized for jewelry and decoration, and rubies. The mountains also provided timber in a region where wood was otherwise scarce, and their snowmelt fed the rivers that made agriculture possible in the valleys below. South of Central Asia lay Persia, one of the richest regions our hypothetical empire could control. Persia had been a center of civilization for 3,000 years before the Mongols arrived. It had sophisticated agriculture based on qanat systems, underground channels that carried water from mountains to fields without losing it to evaporation in the hot sun. This technology allowed agriculture in places that would otherwise be too dry. Persia grew wheat, barley, rice, cotton, and luxury crops like pistachios and pomegranates. Persian cities were ancient and wealthy. Tabriz, Isfahan, Shiraz, Ray, each had populations in the hundreds of thousands at various points in history. They manufactured carpets renowned across the world for their intricate patterns and rich colors. Persian metalwork was exceptional: damascened steel blades, intricate bronze work, silver and gold jewelry. The textile industry produced not just carpets but silk fabrics when silk arrived from China, cotton cloth, and wool. Persian craftsmen were masters whose skills were sought by rulers from Egypt to India. The region also sat on crucial trade routes. Goods moving between Central Asia and the Middle East had to pass through Persian territory. Merchants traveling between India and the Mediterranean often went through Persia. This geographic position meant customs, revenue, and commercial opportunities. Moving east from Mongolia toward the Pacific, we reach Manchuria, a region quite different from either the steppes or the deserts. Manchuria had forests, rivers with reliable water flow, and fertile plains. The climate had cold winters, but warm, wet summers. This made agriculture productive without the extensive irrigation needed further west. Manchuria could grow millet, wheat, soybeans, and other crops. Its forests provided timber for construction and furs. And crucially, Manchuria offered access to the Pacific Ocean, opening possibilities for maritime trade and fishing. And then there was China. If our Tartarian Empire controlled China, at least northern China, and perhaps eventually all of it, it would control the richest, most populous, and most technologically advanced territory in the world. China in the 1400s had somewhere between 60 and 100 million people, more than half the empire's total population. It had agriculture that was the most productive in the world, with rice cultivation in the south producing enormous yields and wheat farming in the north feeding dense populations. China manufactured silk, that luxury fabric that gave the Silk Road its name. Chinese porcelain was so fine that Europeans centuries later would struggle to replicate it. Paper and printing, gunpowder and cannons, the compass for navigation, all were Chinese inventions. Chinese cities were enormous by world standards. Hangzhou in southern China might have had over 1 million inhabitants. Beijing, when it became a capital, had hundreds of thousands. China also had natural resources. Coal deposits, particularly in the north, meant fuel for heating and eventually for industry. Iron ore deposits and sophisticated metallurgy produced high-quality steel. Copper, tin, and other minerals were available. And Chinese organizational capacity, the bureaucracy, the census systems, the examination systems for selecting officials, were the most advanced in the world. But there was a tension here that our Tartarian Empire would have to manage carefully. China was so wealthy, so populous, and so culturally advanced that it tended to absorb its conquerors. The Mongol Yuan dynasty had become increasingly Chinese in character as it ruled China. The later Manchu Qing dynasty would face the same pattern. For our Tartarian Empire to maintain its distinct character while benefiting from Chinese resources would require a delicate balance, being present enough in China to extract resources and maintain control, but not so absorbed by Chinese culture that the empire became essentially Chinese. Now, with all these resources in mind, we come to a crucial question for our hypothetical empire. Where would the capital be? Every great empire needs a heart, a city that serves as the center of power, the symbol of authority, and the meeting point of cultures. The choice would reveal much about the empire's character and priorities. The traditional choice would be Karakorum in Mongolia, where Ögedei Khan had built his capital. This had symbolic power. It kept the empire rooted in the Mongol heartland. But Karakorum was remote, difficult to reach, and small by the standards of great imperial cities. It made sense for a nomadic confederation, but less sense for governing a vast empire that included sophisticated urban civilizations. Beijing offered advantages. It was already a large city with good infrastructure. It provided access to Chinese wealth and population, and it sat near the border between agricultural China and the Mongolian steppes. But Beijing was far to the east, almost at the empire's edge. A ruler in Beijing would be close to China, but distant from Persia, Central Asia, and the Western territories. Central Asian cities like Samarkand were sophisticated and sat at trade route crossroads, but they were too far south, too peripheral to the empire's geographic center. Let me propose what our Tartarian Empire might have developed: a system of multiple capitals, or perhaps a primary capital with the Khan spending different seasons in different cities. This would combine nomadic traditions of mobility with imperial necessities of administration. For our narrative, let's imagine the primary capital being established in the Seer Daria River Valley in Central Asia, perhaps expanding an existing city or founding a new one. This location offers several advantages. It's relatively central to the empire's territories. It's on major trade routes. It has good agricultural land nearby thanks to the river, and it's in a region with sophisticated urban traditions that could provide administrative expertise. Let's call this capital the Twin Cities, a winter capital of permanent stone buildings where administration happens, and a summer encampment a few hours' ride away where traditional nomadic life continues. This duality would symbolize the empire's character: sophisticated and traditional, settled and nomadic, urban and pastoral. The winter capital would grow over centuries into a magnificent city. By the empire's height in the 1500s, perhaps 100,000 people would live there permanently, a large city by medieval standards, though not as enormous as Beijing or later Istanbul. At the heart of the city would be the palace complex, sprawling across perhaps 200 acres. The palace walls would be 30 feet high, made of brick faced with stone, with watchtowers at regular intervals. These walls wouldn't be purely defensive. By the empire's height, the capital would be far from any frontier. They'd be statements of permanence and power. The main gate would be inspired by Persian architecture, a great vaulted opening soaring 60 feet high, the vault decorated with glazed tiles in geometric patterns. Blues and turquoises would predominate, colors associated with heaven in both Tengrist tradition and Islamic art. Gold leaf would accent certain elements, catching the sun and proclaiming wealth to all who approached. Inside the walls, the palace wouldn't be a single building, but a complex of structures around courtyards, following patterns common in both Persian and Chinese architecture. The throne room would be the centerpiece, a great hall capable of holding 1,000 people for audiences and ceremonies. The architecture would show cultural fusion: Mongol proportions, wide and relatively low, adapted to steppe environments, but executed in permanent materials with Persian decorative tiles and Chinese roof styles. Inside, the ceiling might be decorated with geometric patterns from Islamic tradition, but incorporating circular motifs important in Tengrist symbolism. The residential quarters would surround courtyards that served as gardens. Even in a culture that valued the open steppe, the Persian tradition of garden making would be irresistible. Water would be precious and celebrated, channels carrying water from fountains to pools, creating the sound of flowing water that was such a luxury in Central Asian cities. Trees would provide shade. Flowers would bloom in rotation through the seasons. These gardens would be places where the royal family could escape the formality of court life. But here's something unique to our Tartarian Empire. Adjacent to this permanent palace would be an area where a royal ger could be erected whenever the Khan chose. This wouldn't be an ordinary felt tent. It would be enormous, requiring 50 wagons to transport when dismantled, its wooden lattice frame overlaid with gold leaf, its felt covering white, a color of purity in Mongol tradition. Inside would be all the trappings of power, but in a form that maintained connection to nomadic heritage. This combination, permanent palace and royal ger existing side by side, would powerfully symbolize the empire's dual nature. You could rule from stone halls in winter and felt tents in summer. You could be both settled sovereign and nomadic Khan, both patron of urban civilization and heir to the steppes. Beyond the palace, the capital would develop distinct districts. There would be a Chinese quarter, where merchants and craftsmen from the east lived, with architecture showing Chinese influence, courtyards surrounded by wooden buildings, with characteristic upturned eaves. A Persian quarter with buildings of brick and mud plaster around private courtyards. A Russian quarter, districts for various Turkic peoples. Each would have its own markets, its own religious buildings, its own character, but all under the Khan's law and protection. The Great Mosque would be the most magnificent religious building in the city, reflecting Islam's dominance in Central Asia. Imagine an entrance portal, 100 feet high, decorated with glazed tile work forming intricate arabesques and calligraphy quoting the Quran. The courtyard would be vast, capable of holding 10,000 worshippers for Friday prayers. Inside, the prayer hall would be supported by columns creating a forest of stone. And the dome, would be a masterpiece of engineering and art, perhaps double-shelled, with airspace between an inner and outer dome for temperature regulation. The exterior would be covered in turquoise glazed tiles, creating a surface that seemed to glow in sunlight. This dome would be visible from miles away, dominating the city's skyline. But there would also be Buddhist temples, probably in a style influenced by both Tibetan and Chinese Buddhism, with massive Buddha statues covered in gold leaf and walls painted with intricate religious scenes. Christian churches would exist for Armenian and other Christian merchants and officials. And importantly, there would be a sacred space for Tengri, the eternal blue sky god of traditional Mongol religion, because the ruling dynasty would maintain at least formal connection to these traditions, even as many of them converted to Buddhism or Islam. The markets would be extraordinary. The main bazaar would be covered, following Central Asian tradition, brick domes and vaults, creating covered passages where merchants could display goods protected from sun and rain. Walking through these covered streets, you'd see silks from China in every color imaginable, furs from Siberia, including sable and ermine, carpets from Persia with intricate patterns, leather goods from the steppes, spices that had traveled the Silk Road from India and beyond, metalwork and jewelry, books and manuscripts in multiple languages, horses being led through to special markets. The sensory experience would be overwhelming. The visual riot of colors, the smell of spices and leather and animals and cooking food, the sound of merchants calling their wares in a dozen languages, the feel of silk under your fingers as you examined a bolt of fabric. The city would have sophisticated infrastructure. An aqueduct would bring clean water from mountain streams 20 miles away, following Roman engineering principles but built with techniques learned from Persian and Chinese engineers. The water would feed public fountains throughout the city. There would be bathhouses in the Persian style where people could wash and socialize. The streets would be wide enough for horses and carts, paved with stones in the central districts. There would be caravanserais where traveling merchants could stay, combination inn and warehouse and marketplace. Outside the city walls would be the manufacturing districts, tanners working leather, blacksmiths hammering metal, potters firing ceramics, weavers at their looms. These industries would be kept outside because they were noisy, smelly, and posed fire risks, but they were essential to the city's economy and the empire's needs. And then there would be the summer encampment. A few hours' ride from the city, in a valley with good grass and a reliable stream, the Khan and court would spend the warm months living in jurs. Thousands of felt tents would spread across the grassland in organized patterns reflecting social hierarchy. The Khan's ger would be enormous. Noble families would have their own clusters of tents. Warriors would camp in their military units. This wasn't primitive. The finest gers were luxurious inside, with thick carpets covering floors, embroidered hangings on walls, elaborate furniture. Business would still be conducted, embassies received, military campaigns planned, but it would all happen in a setting that maintained connection to nomadic traditions. The empire would need more than just this one capital, however magnificent. Regional centers would be crucial to governing such vast territories. In the west, a major city on the Volga River, let's say Sarai, which was the actual capital of the Golden Horde, would serve as the western regional capital, controlling trade and administering the Russian territories. Samarkand, even if not the imperial capital, would remain one of the empire's greatest cities, perhaps the cultural and intellectual center where scholars gathered and the finest artisans worked. In Persia, Tabriz might serve as the regional capital, the bridge between the empire's Central Asian heartland and the Middle Eastern world. Somewhere in Siberia, a northern city would develop as the hub of the fur trade. In Manchuria, a port city would be crucial for Pacific maritime trade. These cities would be connected by roads and rivers. The yam stations, those postal relay points, would dot the routes every 20 to 30 miles, each with fresh horses, supplies, and basic accommodations. Caravanserais would mark each day's journey for traveling merchants. The empire's infrastructure of roads, bridges, postal stations, and inns would be what transformed scattered territories into an integrated whole. This urban network, connected by maintained routes and protected by military power, backed by the wealth of diverse resources from furs to silk to agricultural surplus, would be the physical foundation of the empire. The cities would be where different cultures mixed, where goods were exchanged, where imperial authority was most visible. Between the cities stretched the countryside where most people lived, but the cities were the nodes that held the network together. Standing in the capital at its height, perhaps in the year 1500, you'd witness something unique in world history. The call to prayer from the great mosque would echo across the city 5 times a day. Merchants from a dozen different peoples would be negotiating in the bazaars, often using Persian as a common language, since no one spoke everyone's native tongue. Children playing in the streets might be mixing words from Mongolian, Turkic languages, Persian, and Chinese into their own pidgin. A Buddhist monk in saffron robes might pass an Orthodox Christian priest in black. The smell would be a mix of cooking food, flatbreads, roasted meat, rice dishes, the yogurt drinks that steppe peoples favored. This would be a place where the old Silk Road reached its highest development, where goods and ideas from across Eurasia met and mingled under a single political authority. As evening fell and the sun set over the distant mountains, you'd see smoke rising from 10,000 cooking fires. The mountains would be silhouetted against a sky turning orange and purple. The last calls from the markets would fade. And in the distance, you might see the gers of the summer encampment, reminding everyone that for all its sophistication, this empire's heart still beat to the rhythm of the steppes. Chapter 5. Architecture and Society Fusion. Architecture reveals the soul of a civilization, and in our hypothetical Tartarian Empire, the buildings and cultural life would tell a story of unprecedented fusion, nomadic traditions meeting settled civilizations, creating something genuinely new. Let's start with what makes Tartarian architecture distinctive in our alternative timeline. The Mongols historically weren't primarily builders of stone monuments. Their architectural genius was the ger, that circular felt tent that could be assembled in hours, stayed warm in brutal winters, and could be packed on wagons and moved with the seasons. But when Mongols conquered settled civilizations, they began building in permanent materials, usually adapting local styles rather than creating entirely new ones. Our Tartarian Empire, lasting for centuries rather than decades, would develop beyond simple adaptation. By the 1500s, there would be a recognizable Tartarian architectural style that balanced multiple influences into something coherent. The imperial palace we've already glimpsed, but let's consider other buildings across the empire. Mosques in the Central Asian cities would be magnificent. The finest might rival anything built in Persia or the Ottoman Empire. Picture a prayer hall where hundreds of columns create a forest of stone, each column slightly different in its carved decoration. The mihrab, The niche, indicating the direction of Mecca, would be a masterpiece of carved stone and tilework. Calligraphy flowing across the walls would quote the Quran in scripts that were themselves works of art. The courtyard would have a central fountain where worshippers could perform ritual ablutions, surrounded by arcades providing shade. But here's where Tartarian mosques might differ from purely Islamic architecture. They'd likely incorporate certain Mongol spatial concepts. The interiors might feel more open, with wider spaces between columns, reflecting steppe people's comfort with openness. The proportions might be different, wider and lower, rather than soaring upward. Color choices might favor the blues and turquoises that Mongols associated with the eternal blue sky of Tengri, their traditional sky god. Buddhist temples in Mongolia, and perhaps even in the capital, would show different cultural blending. Tibetan Buddhism had strong influence among the Mongols, so you'd see architectural elements borrowed from Tibet, those distinctive fortress-like monastery buildings with inward-sloping walls and small windows, but executed on a larger scale than anything built in Tibet itself, because imperial patronage meant more resources. Inside, massive Buddha statues might be covered in gold leaf, applied by craftsmen from China. The wall paintings might blend Tibetan iconography with Chinese painting techniques and even Persian influences in color and composition. Residential architecture would vary dramatically by region and social class, but certain empire-wide patterns might emerge. Wealthy families across the empire might adopt the courtyard house design that worked so well in both Persian and Chinese traditions. The street-facing walls would be plain, even severe, for privacy and security. But inside, opening onto a private courtyard, would be elaborate decorations, gardens, and comfortable living spaces. These courtyards would be adapted to local climates. In Central Asian cities, they'd have fountains and water channels, with gardens providing shade and cooling. In colder northern regions, courtyards might be smaller, more sheltered from wind, with glazed windows letting in light while keeping out cold. In Mongolia, wealthy families might have permanent winter houses in this courtyard style, but still maintain jurs for summer use, combining both traditions. The covered bazaars that were common in Islamic cities would spread across the empire. These were brilliant adaptations to climate. The covered passages stayed cooler than open streets in summer and provided shelter from rain and snow. They also created dramatic lighting effects as sunlight filtered through openings in the domes and vaults. Our Tartarian Empire would build these covered markets in every major city, creating spaces where commerce could flourish regardless of weather. Now, let's talk about the conspiracy theories briefly, because they're relevant here. Modern Tartarian conspiracy theories often point to elaborate Gilded Age buildings from the late 1800s and early 1900s, any 10, grand structures with ornate decorations, and claim they were built by an advanced Tartarian civilization. This is completely wrong. Those buildings are well documented, built by known architects using known techniques. We have the construction records, the architects' names, the documented history. But here's what's worth understanding. Those conspiracy theories arise partly because people see elaborate architecture and find it hard to believe it could be built with old technology. What they miss is that pre-industrial societies had sophisticated engineering knowledge and skilled craftsmen who spent their entire lives perfecting their trades. Our hypothetical Tartarian Empire would build remarkably beautiful buildings, not through mysterious lost technology, but through the accumulated knowledge of multiple civilizations' architectural traditions working together with the resources of a vast empire, funding ambitious projects. A Tartarian building would be remarkable because it synthesized techniques from China, Persia, Central Asia, and nomadic traditions. It would use materials and construction methods available in the 13 through 1700s: brick, stone, wood, glazed tiles, carved plaster, the arch and vault and dome as structural elements. The decoration would be intricate because skilled artisans with years of training could create intricate work, but there would be nothing technologically impossible or mysterious about it. Let's shift now to society and culture, because architecture is just the physical backdrop for human life. Our Tartarian Empire would create a unique social structure and cultural synthesis. At the top of society would be the Khan and the royal family. But unlike some empires with a single absolute ruler, power might be more distributed among the senior members of the extended royal family. Remember, our premise for how this empire stayed unified was a reformed succession system that involved councils of senior princes. This would mean multiple members of the royal family would hold significant power as regional governors, military commanders, and administrators. Below them would be the warrior aristocracy, Mongol and Turkic nobles, who provided cavalry for the army and held lands in return for military service. This group would maintain nomadic traditions even as the empire became more settled. They'd spend summers on the steppes with their herds, winters in towns or cities. Their sons would learn to ride and shoot from childhood. Their daughters, at least in elite families, might have more freedom than in some settled societies. 70. Mongol tradition gave aristocratic women significant property rights and sometimes political influence. The merchant class would be crucial and increasingly wealthy. Long-distance trade across the Silk Road required capital, organization, and risk-taking. Successful merchant families could become very rich. Unlike in some societies where merchants were looked down upon, in our Tartarian Empire, they'd be respected because they generated the tax revenue that funded the state. Merchants would often be cosmopolitan, speaking multiple languages, comfortable in different cultures, forming partnerships that crossed ethnic lines. Artisan guilds would organize skilled craftsmen. In every major city, you'd have guilds for different trades: weavers, metalworkers, potters, carpenters, leather workers, and many others. These guilds would control training through apprenticeships, maintain quality standards, and often had significant political influence in urban affairs. A master craftsman in his prime might be quite prosperous and highly respected. Below them in status, but far more numerous, would be farmers and herders, the people who produced the food that fed everyone else. In agricultural regions like China and parts of Central Asia, farmers worked lands they might own, rent, or work as tenants for aristocratic landlords. Their lives would follow the rhythms of planting and harvest, punctuated by festivals, religious observances, and the occasional crisis of drought, flood, or war. On the steppes, herders would continue traditional nomadic life patterns that had existed for thousands of years. They'd measure wealth in animals, horses primarily, but also sheep, goats, cattle, and camels. They'd move with the seasons, following grass. Their felt tents could be packed up and moved quickly. They'd have closer ties to the warrior aristocracy than settled farmers did, because every herder was potentially a warrior, comfortable on horseback and familiar with bows. Religious diversity would be a defining feature of Tartarian society. Islam would dominate in Central Asia and among many Turkic peoples. The calls to prayer would echo from minarets 5 times a day. During Ramadan, the faithful would fast from dawn to sunset. Pilgrimage to Mecca would be an aspiration for devout Muslims who could afford the journey. Buddhism would be strong among Mongols, and in any Tibetan territories the empire controlled. Monasteries would be centers of learning. Monks in their distinctive robes would be common sights. Prayer wheels would spin, prayer flags would flutter, and the deep sound of long horns would call monks to prayer. Orthodox Christianity would be practiced by Russians and others in Western territories. Churches with their distinctive onion domes would dot cities and towns. Icons would be venerated, and religious festivals would mark the calendar. And beneath all these organized religions, older shamanic traditions would persist, especially in Siberia and Mongolia. Shamans who could supposedly communicate with spirits, heal illnesses, and predict the future would continue to practice, sometimes incorporating elements of Buddhism or other religions into syncretic folk beliefs. The key point is that the empire would need to maintain pragmatic tolerance. The Khan might personally be Buddhist, as many Mongol rulers were, or convert to Islam for political reasons, but imperial policy would allow different faiths to coexist. This wasn't tolerance in the modern sense of believing in religious freedom as a human right, it was practical governance. Trying to force religious uniformity would cause rebellions the empire couldn't afford. Education would vary dramatically across the empire. In Islamic areas, boys from families who could afford it would attend madrasas, religious schools attached to mosques where they'd memorize the Quran, study Arabic, learn Islamic law and theology. The best students might go on to advanced studies in subjects like mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, building on the rich intellectual tradition of the Islamic Golden Age. In Chinese territories, if the empire controlled them, a modified examination system might continue. The traditional Chinese system allowed commoners to rise to high positions by passing examinations on Confucian classics. The empire might adapt this, keeping the examinations to select capable administrators, but perhaps adding requirements that officials also know Mongol and understand steppe traditions. For the warrior aristocracy, education would focus on practical skills. Young nobles would learn to ride, shoot bows from horseback, wrestle, hunt, and eventually lead men in battle. But they'd also learn about the empire's history, the great campaigns of Genghis Khan, and their family's role in the imperial story. Literate nobles might study poetry, history, and philosophy as marks of cultivation. Cultural achievements would flourish with imperial patronage. Literature would be particularly interesting. Persian had long been a literary language across Central Asia and Persia, and this would likely continue. Poets would compose verses in Persian that would be recited in courts across the empire. But there might also be literary works in Mongolian, perhaps written in the Mongolian script that was adapted from Uyghur script, or in the Fags-Pa script that Kublai Khan commissioned. Stories and histories in Chinese would continue in the Eastern territories. The content of this literature would reflect the empire's character. Epic poems might celebrate Genghis Khan and the great Khans who followed him. Historical chronicles would record the empire's deeds. Love poetry might blend Persian romantic traditions with Mongol and Chinese influences. Religious literature, Buddhist sutras, Islamic theological works, Confucian commentaries, would continue their separate traditions but might occasionally show cross-influence. Art would show similar fusion. Persian miniature painting was already a highly developed tradition, showing detailed scenes from literature and history in jewel-like colors. Chinese painting had its own sophisticated traditions of landscape and nature studies. These might blend, with artists borrowing techniques from each tradition. Mongol patrons might commission paintings of great hunts or military campaigns executed in Persian or Chinese styles. Carpets from Central Asia and Persia were already art forms, with intricate patterns woven into wool and silk. These would continue to develop, perhaps incorporating new motifs that reflected the empire's diverse heritage. Metalwork was another area where different traditions could blend. Persian damascening techniques on blades, Mongol traditions of silver decoration for horse equipment, Chinese bronze casting. Music would be everywhere. In cities, there might be formal performances for aristocratic audiences, Persian classical music with its elaborate melodic modes, Chinese opera with its distinctive singing styles, and combinations of both. In the markets and streets, there'd be folk musicians, drummers, flute players, stringed instrument players from various traditions. In gurs on the steppes, there'd be throat singing, a distinctive Mongol vocal technique where a singer produces multiple pitches simultaneously, creating an otherworldly sound. Around evening fires, people would tell stories and sing songs that had been passed down for generations. Cuisine would be one of the most immediate and accessible areas of cultural fusion. Every city would have its own food culture, but trade and movement of peoples would spread dishes and ingredients. Central Asian cities would have pilaf, rice cooked with meat and vegetables, flavored with spices. Chinese dishes might spread westward, dumplings, noodles, stir-fried vegetables. Mongol and Turkic dairy products, yogurt, kumis made from fermented mare's milk, dried curds, would be common on the steppes and might be adopted in cities. Persian cooking with its elaborate rice dishes, stews, and sweets would influence the imperial court and spread from there. Tea from China would likely become popular across the empire, served in different ways in different regions. Daily life would vary enormously depending on where and how you lived. But let's imagine some snapshots. In the capital city, a wealthy merchant's morning might begin with prayers, then breakfast with his family in their courtyard, while servants brought news from the caravanserai, where his goods were stored. His day might involve negotiations in the bazaar, perhaps meeting with merchants from distant cities, making deals that would send silk west and furs east. Evening might include a visit to the bathhouse, then dinner with extended family, perhaps followed by entertainment, musicians or storytellers performing for guests. On the Mongolian steppes, a herder's family would wake in their ger as sunlight filtered through the smoke hole at the top. Breakfast would be milk tea and dried meat. Then the day's work, checking the herds, moving them to fresh pasture, making repairs to equipment, milking animals, processing milk into yogurt and cheese. Children would help with lighter tasks while also playing. racing horses, practicing with small bows. Evening would bring the family together for a meal, perhaps boiled mutton, then songs and stories before sleep. In a Chinese village, if the empire controlled the region, life would follow agricultural rhythms. Planting season would see everyone in the fields from dawn to dusk. Growing season would require constant attention to irrigation, weeding, protecting crops from pests. Harvest would again be all-consuming work. Between these peaks, there'd be time for maintenance, for craft work that supplemented farming income, for festivals and religious observances that broke up the year. Peasants would have limited direct contact with the empire, mainly through tax collectors and occasional demands for labor service. But the presence of imperial authority would shape their lives nonetheless. Common threads would run through all these different lives. Everyone would be aware of the Khan's authority, however distant. Tax collection was universal. Whether you paid in silver, in kind with grain or animals, or with labor service, the empire took its share. This wasn't necessarily oppressive if administered fairly, because those taxes funded the security that allowed trade to flourish and protected against external enemies. Trade connections meant local products might reach distant markets. The furs a Siberian trapper collected might end up adorning a Persian nobleman's coat. The silk a Chinese farmer's daughter helped produce might be woven into a carpet in Bukhara. The horses a Mongol herder raised might carry warriors or pull carts hundreds of miles away. This economic integration would create a sense, however dim, of being part of something larger. Language would be fascinating. Most people would speak their native tongue, Mongolian, various Turkic languages, Persian, Chinese, Russian, and dozens more. But in cities and along trade routes, multilingualism would be common. Merchants would need to know several languages. Administrators might work in Persian as a lingua franca for official business, while also knowing Mongol and local languages. Children growing up in diverse cities might naturally become multilingual, picking up words and phrases from neighbors who spoke different languages. Written language would be complex. Persian, written in Arabic script, would be widely used for literature, commerce, and administration in Central Asian and Persian regions. Chinese characters would be used in the East. Mongolian could be written in several scripts. Arabic would be used for religious purposes by Muslims. This multilingual written world would require scribes and translators, creating employment for educated people who could bridge these linguistic divides. Looking at the capital city at sunset, as merchants closed their stalls and families gathered for evening meals, as the call to prayer echoed from the great mosque and monks in Buddhist temples chanted their evening prayers, as smoke rose from thousands of cooking fires and the smell of different cuisines mixed in the air, you'd see something unique in world history. Not a melting pot where cultures blended into uniformity, but a mosaic where distinct pieces created a larger, more complex pattern. This society wouldn't be perfect or utopian. There would be tensions between groups, prejudices, conflicts over resources and status. The rich would live in luxury while the poor struggled. Women's status would vary by culture and class, but would generally be subordinate to men, though perhaps with more rights in Mongol and some Turkic societies than in others. Slavery would likely exist, as it did historically across Eurasia, though perhaps more in the form of household servants and war captives than the plantation slavery that would develop in other parts of the world. But what makes this hypothetical Tartarian society interesting isn't perfection. It's the sheer diversity held together under a single political structure, the cultural exchange that would happen when peoples who might otherwise never meet found themselves living side by side in imperial cities, trading in the same markets, sometimes even intermarrying and creating families that themselves embodied cultural fusion. This is the human landscape that would fill the architectural spaces we've imagined, diverse. Chapter 6: Power and Economy, the Engines of Empire. Every empire runs on two fuels: military power that establishes and maintains control, and economic prosperity that funds everything else. Our hypothetical Tartarian Empire would need both in abundance to hold together territories spanning half of Asia for centuries. Let's explore how the machinery of power and wealth might have functioned. The military would be the steel backbone of the empire. Without it, nothing else matters. Regional governors rebel, neighbors invade, trade routes become dangerous, and unity collapses. The Mongol military tradition would form the foundation. but it would need to evolve over the centuries to remain effective. The core strength would remain cavalry. The Mongol horse archer had been the most effective military unit in the world during the 1300s, and that advantage would need to be maintained. These weren't just warriors who happened to fight on horseback. They were people who'd grown up in the saddle, who could ride for days, who could shoot accurately while galloping at full speed. Training began in childhood on the steppes. Boys learned to ride almost before they could walk, started with small bows hunting rabbits and birds, graduated to full-sized bows and larger game, and by their teenage years were ready for war. The organization was brilliantly simple. Units were organized decimally: squads of 10, companies of 100, regiments of 1,000, divisions of 10,000. Each level had clear command structures. A soldier knew exactly who commanded him, and commanders knew exactly who they commanded. Orders could flow down quickly. Reports could flow up efficiently. This wasn't revolutionary in itself. Other armies had used similar systems. But the Mongols implemented it with unusual thoroughness, and our Tartarian Empire would maintain this clarity of organization. Mobility was crucial. A Mongol army could cover 100 miles in a day when necessary, moving faster than any enemy could anticipate. Each warrior had multiple horses, typically 3 to 5, and would rotate between them to keep all fresh. When one horse tired, you'd switch to another. This meant you could maintain speed over long distances that would exhaust armies limited to a single horse per rider. Supply trains were minimal. Warriors carried dried meat and could supplement by hunting or requisitioning supplies locally. Tactics combined discipline with flexibility. The feigned retreat was a classic Mongol tactic: appear to flee in disorder, drawing the enemy into pursuit, then wheel around and attack their disordered formation. Encirclement was standard strategy, using superior mobility to get around enemy flanks and attack from multiple sides simultaneously. And arrow storms, thousands of warriors releasing arrows in coordinated volleys, could devastate enemy formations before close combat even began. But here's the challenge our Tartarian Empire would face. Military technology was changing. Gunpowder, invented in China, was transforming warfare. By the 1400s, cannons were becoming more effective. Firearms were developing, and while early guns were slow and unreliable, they were improving. By the 15 and 1600s, musket-armed infantry could stop cavalry charges that would have been unstoppable 2 centuries earlier. Our empire would need to adapt. The advantage would be controlling China, where gunpowder technology was most advanced. Chinese engineers could design cannons. Workshops could manufacture firearms. The empire would need to integrate these new weapons while maintaining traditional cavalry strength. Perhaps field armies would combine Mongol cavalry with Chinese artillery and infantry, the cavalry providing mobility and shock power, the infantry holding ground, and the cannons providing devastating firepower at key moments. Siege warfare was another area where adaptation would be essential. The Mongols under Genghis Khan had learned siege techniques from Chinese engineers and became expert at taking fortified cities. Our Tartarian Empire would need to maintain this expertise. Engineers would be valued members of the military establishment. They'd know how to build siege engines, catapults and trebuchets for throwing stones or incendiary materials over walls. They'd understand sapping, digging tunnels under walls to collapse them. And increasingly, they'd use cannons to breach fortifications, as gunpowder made traditional walls vulnerable. Naval power would matter if the empire controlled Pacific coastlines through Manchuria. This wasn't traditional Mongol territory, but empires must adapt to the territories they control. Chinese shipbuilding expertise was the most advanced in the world. The treasure fleet that Admiral Zheng He commanded in the early 1400s consisted of ships far larger than anything Europe would build for another century. Our Tartarian Empire could build on this tradition, creating a Pacific fleet that could protect coastal trade, suppress piracy, and project power to nearby islands and coastlines. The military wouldn't just exist to fight external enemies. It would be the ultimate enforcer of internal unity. Every regional governor would know that the Great Khan commanded armies that could be directed against rebels. Garrisons in key cities would keep order and serve as symbols of imperial authority. The military would also handle large-scale banditry. Armed groups that preyed on merchants would find themselves facing organized military responses. Recruitment would draw from across the empire. The steppe peoples, Mongols, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other Turkic groups would provide the cavalry elite. This was their military tradition, their way of life. Chinese territories would provide infantry and technical specialists. Persian and Central Asian territories would provide both cavalry and infantry. Russians might serve in specialized units. This diversity could be a strength if managed properly. Different peoples brought different military traditions and skills. The challenge would be maintaining loyalty when troops came from so many different backgrounds. Payment would be crucial. Soldiers who were paid regularly and fairly would be more reliable than those whose pay was in arrears. But beyond pay, there would need to be a sense of identity as imperial soldiers, pride in serving the Khan, and belief that the empire provided opportunities for advancement. Officers from humble backgrounds who rose through merit would be proof that the system could work for anyone. Now, let's talk about the economic engines that would fund all of this. Military power is expensive. Soldiers need to be paid. Horses need to be fed. Equipment needs to be manufactured and maintained. And beyond the military, there's administration to fund, infrastructure to maintain, palaces to build, and courts to support. All of this requires revenue, and revenue comes from economic activity. The foundation of the economy would be the Silk Road. This wasn't a single road, but a network of trade routes connecting east and west, and our Tartarian Empire would control virtually all of it. This was the economic equivalent of controlling the world's major shipping lanes today. Goods traveling from China to Europe had to pass through imperial territory for nearly the entire journey. The empire could tax this trade while providing the security that made merchants willing to undertake such long, dangerous journeys. What traveled these routes? From east to west, silk, that luxury fabric that gave the roads their name, produced in China and desired across Eurasia. Porcelain, Chinese ceramics so fine that Europeans later called good China porcelain because they first encountered it through this trade. Tea, which would eventually become one of the world's most traded commodities. Spices from Southeast Asia that reached China and then traveled west. Paper, playing cards, and printing technology, all Chinese innovations. From west to east, gold and silver, precious metals to purchase Asian goods. Glassware from the Mediterranean and Persia, a technology the Chinese hadn't fully mastered. Precious stones. Wool textiles from Europe and Central Asia. And constantly in both directions, horses, always in demand, with different breeds prized in different regions. But beyond these luxury goods, there was everyday commerce. Cotton fabric from Central Asia, dried fruits from Persian and Central Asian orchards, metalwork, tools, weapons, decorative objects, carpets from Persia and Central Asia, prized across the world, leather goods, furs from Siberia, particularly valuable, basic commodities like grain when regions faced shortages. The empire would tax this trade at multiple points. Cities along the routes would charge customs duties. Caravanserais, those fortified inns, might be imperial monopolies, charging fees. The protection the empire provided wasn't free. Merchants would pay for the privilege of traveling safely. But if the rates weren't extortionate, merchants would accept them because the alternative, trying to cross these territories without imperial protection, would be far more dangerous and expensive. Internal trade within the empire would also be significant and would grow over time. Furs from Siberia traveled south to markets in Central Asia, Persia, and China. Silk from China traveled west. Horses bred on the steppes were distributed across the empire. Grain from agricultural regions fed cities and armies. This internal commerce would create economic interdependence. A city in Central Asia would depend on grain from China or grain-growing regions closer by. Siberian trading posts would depend on manufactured goods from the south. Everyone benefited from being part of the imperial trade network. Industrial production would be concentrated in certain regions based on resources and expertise. Textile manufacturing would flourish in Central Asian cities and in China. The workshops might employ hundreds of workers, spinning thread, weaving fabric, dyeing cloth in vibrant colors, using techniques that were trade secrets. The finest silk production would remain in China, but working silk into finished products could happen across the empire. Metalworking would be crucial. Every army needs weapons and armor. Every household needs tools. Cities need nails, hinges, locks, and countless other metal products. The Urals provided iron ore. Copper came from various mountain ranges. Skilled smiths would work in every city, but certain centers might become famous, perhaps a city known for the finest sword blades, another for the best armor, a third for intricate decorative metalwork. Leatherworking would be a major industry. With millions of livestock across the empire, hides were abundant. Tanning leather, turning raw hide into durable, flexible material, was skilled work using techniques passed down through generations. Leather was needed for shoes, boots, saddles, armor, containers, bookbindings, and dozens of other uses. The best leather goods might come from workshops that had been perfecting their craft for centuries. Furs required different processing than leather. Siberian furs were the empire's most valuable natural resource after agricultural products. Trappers would bring pelts to trading posts. There they'd be processed, cleaned, stretched, dried. The finest sable pelts might be worth their weight in silver. These would be reserved for the wealthiest customers. Lesser furs, fox, ermine, beaver, were still valuable and found ready markets. Shipbuilding would be significant if the empire controlled Pacific coastlines. Constructing large ships required sophisticated knowledge of wood properties, joinery, waterproofing, and sail design. Chinese shipbuilding traditions were highly advanced. Shipyards would employ carpenters, rope makers, sail makers, and other specialists. These weren't just building merchant vessels but also warships for the imperial navy. Currency and banking would be essential for an economy this complex. Carrying large amounts of coins across thousands of miles was impractical and dangerous. The empire would need more sophisticated financial instruments. China had already developed paper money by this period. The Yuan dynasty, under Kublai Khan, used it extensively, though inflation eventually undermined confidence in it. Our Tartarian Empire might develop a more stable paper currency backed by precious metals, usable across the empire for large transactions. Banking houses would emerge in major trading cities. These weren't banks in the modern sense, but rather merchant families or partnerships that held deposits, made loans, and crucially, provided letters of credit. A merchant in Bukhara could deposit silver with a banking house and receive a letter of credit, redeemable in Beijing, avoiding the need to transport the actual silver across thousands of dangerous miles. The banking house would take a commission for this service, but it was worth it for the security. Standardization would help trade flow smoothly. Standard weights and measures across the empire would make commerce easier. A merchant wouldn't need to convert between a dozen different systems. Standard coin denominations, perhaps gold coins for large transactions, silver for medium, copper for small, would be accepted everywhere. These practical measures might seem mundane, but they were crucial infrastructure for a commercial economy. Agricultural surplus was the foundation everything else rested on. Cities, armies, artisans, merchants, administrators, all these non-food producers needed to eat, and that food came from farmers and herders. China's agricultural productivity was extraordinary. Rice cultivation in southern China, using sophisticated irrigation and multiple cropping seasons, produced yields that no other region could match. Northern China grew wheat, millet, and soybeans. These agricultural heartlands could feed huge populations and still produce surplus for export. Central Asian oases, while much smaller in total area, were also productive where irrigation reached. Persian agricultural systems using quanats allowed farming in places that would otherwise be too dry. The steppes, while not suited for farming, produced livestock, meat, milk, wool, and leather from millions of animals that converted grass into products humans could use. Resource extraction was another economic pillar. Mining in the Urals and other mountain ranges produced the metals the empire needed. This was hard, dangerous work done by miners who labored underground in terrible conditions. But it was profitable for those who controlled the mines and essential for the empire's economy. Iron for tools and weapons, copper for coins and bronze, silver and gold for currency and jewelry, all came from these mines. Salt deserves special mention because it's so easily overlooked in the modern world where it's cheap and abundant. In pre-refrigeration times, salt was essential for preserving meat and fish. It was also needed in certain industrial processes like leather tanning. Salt deposits, or the ability to evaporate salt from seawater, made certain locations valuable. The empire would monopolize or heavily tax salt production, as many historical states did. because it was a necessity everyone needed. The economic challenges would be substantial. Moving goods across vast distances was slow and expensive. A caravan might take 6 months to travel from eastern China to the western edge of the empire. That meant capital was tied up for long periods. Merchant ventures were risky. Caravans could be lost to bandits despite imperial protection, to sandstorms in deserts, to harsh weather in mountains. Only high-value goods could justify the cost and risk of such long-distance trade. Economic inequality would be significant and growing. Successful merchants could become fabulously wealthy. Landowners in fertile regions with many tenants could live in luxury. But farmers working marginal land, herders with small flocks, urban laborers, and certainly slaves, were poor. This inequality could create social tensions. The empire would need to prevent inequality from becoming so extreme that it caused rebellions. Taxation was how the empire converted economic activity into state revenue. Agricultural taxes were the foundation, a percentage of the harvest, paid in kind, or converted to money. China had sophisticated systems for assessing land productivity and taxing accordingly. Trade taxes came from customs duties and market fees. Mining output could be directly taxed, or the mines operated as state monopolies. There might be a head tax, a fixed amount each household paid. Wealthy individuals might pay additional taxes, or be expected to fund public works as a form of taxation. The key was keeping taxation at sustainable levels. Tax too lightly, and the empire doesn't have revenue for necessary functions. Tax too heavily, and you discourage economic activity and cause resentment. Finding the right balance required competent administrators who understood local conditions. This is why the empire would need bureaucrats drawn from local populations who knew what was realistic to demand. When maritime trade routes began bypassing the Silk Road, as Portuguese and other European ships found ways to sail around Africa to reach Asia directly in the late 1400s and 1500s, this would strike at the economic heart of our Tartarian Empire. If goods could travel by ship from China to Europe without passing through imperial territory, the empire lost its ability to tax that trade. This would be one factor in the empire's eventual decline, reducing its revenue just as expenses remained high. But until that happened, the combination of military power and economic prosperity would create a self-reinforcing system. Military power secured trade routes and kept internal order. This security encouraged commerce. Commerce generated tax revenue. Revenue funded the military and administration. As long as this cycle remained positive, the empire would remain strong. When it turned negative, when military expenses exceeded revenue, when trade declined, when corruption reduced the efficiency of tax collection, the empire would begin its long decline. Standing in the capital's commercial district on a busy market day, you'd see this economic engine in action. Caravans arriving after months of travel, their goods being unloaded and assessed for customs. Merchants haggling in multiple languages, making deals that would send products across continents. Banking houses where letters of credit were being issued. Craftsmen in their workshops producing goods for local sale and export. Tax collectors making their rounds. Money changing hands in coins bearing the Khan's seal. Everything moving, everything connected, all part of the vast economic network that made the empire not just powerful but wealthy. This wealth and power, working together, would be what held the empire together through its centuries of existence and what made it a major force in world affairs. Chapter 7. Daily Life Across the Empire. Statistics and grand strategies can tell us what an empire controlled, but to truly understand it, we need to see how actual people lived their daily lives. Let's step into the shoes of different individuals across our hypothetical Tartarian Empire, experiencing their worlds from the inside. In the capital city, dawn breaks over the great mosque's turquoise dome. The first call to prayer echoes across rooftops, waking the faithful. In a wealthy merchant's courtyard house, the master of the household rises from his bed. His bedroom opens onto a private courtyard where a fountain trickles softly. This is autumn, so the morning air is cool but pleasant. He performs his ablutions at the fountain, then kneels on his prayer rug facing toward Mecca, joining thousands of others across the city in morning prayer. After prayers comes breakfast with his family. His wife and teenage children join him in the courtyard as servants bring fresh bread, yogurt, honey, and tea. The merchant reviews his plans for the day with his eldest son, who is learning the family business. There's a caravan arriving today from the east, 6 months on the road from a city near the Chinese border. It carries silk, porcelain, and tea. The merchant has invested heavily in this caravan, and its safe arrival will bring substantial profit. But first, customs must be paid, goods must be inspected, and then the delicate negotiations with buyers will begin. By mid-morning, the merchant is in the covered bazaar. The vaulted passages are already crowded. The air is filled with sounds, merchants calling their wares in multiple languages, customers haggling over prices, the clatter of pack animals being led through, children running errands for their parents' shops. The smells are overwhelming. Spices from dozens of regions, leather goods, the sweet scent of dried fruits, the less pleasant odors of livestock being led to market, cooking food from vendors selling breakfast to those who've been working since dawn. The merchant makes his way to the caravanserai, where the newly arrived caravan has stopped. The courtyard is chaos, travel-stained men unloading hundreds of pack animals, guards standing watch over valuable goods, the caravan master shouting orders. The merchant greets the caravan master, whom he knows from previous ventures. They embrace, exchange news, and share tea while discussing business. The caravan master reports losses: 2 men dead from illness, some goods damaged when a bridge collapsed, delays from unexpectedly early snow in mountain passes. But overall, it's been a successful journey. The real negotiation begins. The merchant examines the silk closely, checking quality. The finest silk will go to the Khan's court and to the wealthiest families. Medium quality will sell to prosperous families across the city. Lower grades will be sent to other cities for sale. The porcelain must be unwrapped carefully. Each piece has been packed in straw and cloth, but breakage is common on such long journeys. The tea is checked for moisture damage. Prices are discussed, percentages calculated, and finally, a deal is struck. The merchant will take all of certain items, part of others. Letters of credit are written and exchanged. The transaction involves no physical coins. Everything is done through the banking house, where both men have accounts. By afternoon, the merchant is back in his shop in the bazaar, displaying some of the newly acquired goods. Buyers come, other merchants looking for goods to transport to distant cities, wealthy families furnishing their homes, agents purchasing for noble households. A woman, veiled and accompanied by servants, examines silk for a dress. A Chinese merchant considers porcelain for export back east. Fine Persian porcelain might fetch good prices in China, just as Chinese porcelain sells well here. An emissary from a distant city's Khan examines a ceremonial tea set. Evening brings leisure. The merchant visits the bathhouse, a domed building with multiple rooms of different temperatures. He strips and enters the warm room, letting the heat loosen muscles tired from the day's standing and negotiating. An attendant scrubs him vigorously, then he moves to the hot room, where steam makes breathing heavy but drives out fatigue. Finally, the cold plunge, shocking but invigorating. Clean and refreshed, he dresses and joins friends in the bathhouse's social area, drinking tea and discussing business, politics, and gossip. Someone mentions that a new governor has been appointed to the Eastern Territories. Another shares a rumor about tensions with the kingdom to the south. Complaints about the most recent tax assessment. Speculation about whether the Khan will travel to this city next summer. Home by dusk, the merchant's household gathers for the evening meal. Extended family has arrived. His brother with his wife and children. His sister-in-law widowed last year. The meal is substantial. Pilaf with meat and carrots, flatbread still warm from the oven, roasted vegetables, yogurt, fruit for dessert. Conversation flows around the low table where everyone sits on cushions. The children are sent to bed after dinner, but the adults remain, talking late into the evening. Before sleep, the merchant reviews his accounts by lamplight. The numbers are good. The caravan investment will pay off handsomely. Life is prosperous in the capital of the empire. Now let's travel to the Mongolian steppes, 1,000 miles northeast. Here, dawn finds a herder emerging from his ger. The felt tent kept the family warm through the autumn night, the fire in the central hearth banked to coals. Outside, the landscape stretches to the horizon in every direction, rolling grassland under an enormous sky. The herder can see his animals scattered across the landscape, horses in one group, sheep and goats in another, a few cattle near the tent. His morning begins by rekindling the fire and putting a kettle on to boil. Milk tea is the first meal of the day. Tea mixed with milk and salt in the Mongol fashion, different from how it's drunk in China or Central Asia. His wife is already milking the mares, working down the line of horses while the foals nuzzle their mothers. The herder helps, then checks the animals for any signs of injury or illness. A sheep has been injured by a wolf in the night. They can see the tracks. He'll have to be more vigilant, perhaps move the flocks closer to the tent. The day's work varies with the season. This is autumn, time for preparing for winter. The summer's newborn animals are strong now. Some male lambs will be slaughtered for meat. The family can't feed all of them through winter. The meat will be dried or frozen in the increasingly cold nights. Some will be traded at the nearby town. The horses are in good condition, fattened on summer grass. A few will be sold. The herder has agreements with military commanders who need horses for the imperial cavalry. This is how he pays his taxes, not in silver, which he rarely sees, but in horses and livestock. By midday, the herder is repairing the winter shelter, where the animals will be kept during the worst weather. It's built partially underground, providing protection from wind and better retaining what little heat the animals generate. The roof is timber and turf, heavy enough to withstand snow. This work is crucial. Animals that freeze in winter are wealth lost. His children help with chores. His daughter, perhaps 10 years old, is responsible for the younger animals, making sure the lambs don't stray, watching that the foals stay with their mothers. His son, 13, is learning adult skills. He can ride any horse in the herd, is becoming skilled with the bow, and is starting to help with the heavy work of moving the animals and maintaining equipment. In a few more years, he'll be old enough to join the cavalry if he chooses. Military service offers opportunities, regular pay, chances for advancement, seeing distant parts of the empire. The family's connection to the larger empire is intermittent but real. The herder serves in the local Khan's forces when called, usually just for training exercises, though older men remember the last border war with a neighboring people 20 years ago. Every few years, a census official visits, recording the family's size and wealth for imperial records. Tax collectors come for their due. Merchants arrive with goods the family can't produce themselves: metal tools, cloth, tea, flour. The herder might travel to town twice a year to trade, sell animals, and purchase necessities. But mostly, life follows ancient patterns. The family moves with the seasons: summer pastures in the mountains where it's cooler, winter camps in protected valleys. The animals dictate the rhythm. Lambing season in spring is exhausting, with constant vigilance needed to protect vulnerable newborns. Summer is relatively easier, with long days and abundant grass. Autumn is preparation time. Winter is endurance, keeping animals and family alive through months of bitter cold. Evening in the ger is warm and intimate. The fire crackles. Dinner is boiled mutton. They slaughtered a sheep yesterday, and the family will eat mutton until it's gone. There's yogurt made from mare's milk, dried curds, and tea. After dinner, the herder tells stories to his children, tales of Genghis Khan and the great conquests, family stories of ancestors who fought in famous battles, legends of heroes and monsters. His wife works by firelight, sewing a deal, the traditional Mongol robe. The youngest child falls asleep against her mother. Outside, the wind picks up. The first winter storms are coming, but inside the ger, the family is warm and together. Now, let's shift to a Chinese village, assuming the empire controls at least northern China. This village is in agricultural territory, growing wheat and millet. The landscape is different from the empty steppes. Here, every scrap of land is cultivated. Fields stretch in every direction, divided by paths and irrigation ditches. The village itself is a cluster of mud brick houses with tile or thatch roofs. A farmer wakes before dawn. This is late autumn, after the harvest but before winter truly sets in. The grain is stored, some kept for the family's use, some sold to pay taxes, some sold for cash to buy necessities. The farmer's day begins with feeding the few animals the family keeps: chickens, a pig, perhaps an ox for ploughing. Then breakfast, simple but filling: millet porridge, pickled vegetables left from summer. The farmer's work today is maintenance and preparation. The fields need clearing of stubble and turning to prepare for next spring's planting. Irrigation ditches need to be cleaned before they freeze. The house needs repairs. The roof developed leaks during autumn rains and must be patched. These aren't emergency tasks, but necessary work that prevents future problems. The farmer works alongside his adult son. His elderly father, too old for heavy labor, watches the grandchildren and does lighter work around the house. The farmer's wife and daughter-in-law are processing the last of the harvest, grinding grain into flour, pickling vegetables in large ceramic jars, making preparations that will feed the family through winter. The village has its own rhythms. There's a headman, chosen from among the more prosperous families, who deals with imperial officials and settles minor disputes. Serious crimes or major disputes would go to the magistrate in the district town a day's walk away, but the village tries to handle most matters internally. There's a small shrine where villagers pray to local deities and ancestors. A traveling monk visits periodically, and some villagers are Buddhist, but folk beliefs are strong. Prayers for good harvests, offerings to spirits of the land, festivals marking the agricultural calendar. The farmer's connection to the empire is primarily through taxation. Imperial officials assess the land each year, determining how much tax is owed based on acreage and estimated productivity. Payment is partly in kind, grain that goes to feed the army and administration, and partly in copper coins. The farmer has to sell some harvest to get coins, so he makes trips to the market town. There he sells grain, buys necessities like salt and cloth that the village can't produce, and hears news from beyond the village. Military conscription is another connection. The farmer's nephew was taken for army service 3 years ago. The family hears occasional news. He's stationed somewhere far to the west, in lands the family can barely imagine. They don't know if he's still alive. Military service offers opportunity for those who survive, regular pay, possible advancement, but it also means years away from home and the risk of never returning. By midday, the farmer takes a break, eating lunch in the field, cold millet cakes and tea. His thoughts drift to next year's planting. If spring comes early, they can get crops in sooner, meaning better yields. If the summer isn't too dry or too wet, if pests don't devastate the crops, if the autumn harvest weather is good, the family will prosper. But so much depends on factors beyond control. He says a silent prayer to whatever powers might listen. Evening finds the extended family together. 3 generations share the house. It's crowded, but normal. Dinner is more substantial. Noodles with vegetables, perhaps a bit of pork from the pig they slaughtered last month. The farmer's father tells stories to the grandchildren about when he was young, about how different things were, about hard times and good times. The women clean up after the meal. The farmer smokes a pipe by the fire, reviewing the day and planning tomorrow. Sleep comes easily after a day of physical labor. Finally, let's travel to the Siberian frontier, to one of the trading posts along a great river. This is the edge of the empire, where civilization meets wilderness. The trading post is a cluster of log buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade. Inside the walls, perhaps 50 people live permanently. Merchants, administrators collecting tribute for the empire, a small military garrison, craftsmen, and families. The post serves multiple purposes. Indigenous peoples bring furs here to trade. Trappers working deeper in the forest return here to sell their catch. Goods from the south, manufactured items, tea, flour, cloth, are distributed from here. And the post collects tribute for the empire, a tax paid in furs by the indigenous peoples, collected by the imperial representative. A fur trader wakes in his log cabin. The autumn morning is already cold, frost on the windows, his breath visible in the air. He rekindles the fire in the stone hearth that dominates one wall. By winter, which is coming soon, this fire will burn day and night. The cabin is small, single-roomed, but well built with chinked logs that keep out wind. It's warmer than you might expect once the fire gets going. After a breakfast of preserved meat and tea, the trader goes to check his stock. He has a warehouse building where furs are stored, hundreds of pelts hanging from rafters or packed in bundles. Sable, the most valuable, are kept separate and carefully counted. Fox pelts, both red and Arctic white. Ermine, some beaver and marten. These represent months of work by trappers who venture deep into the forest, setting traps, checking them in, brutal cold, skinning, and preparing the pelts. The trader purchased these furs from the trappers, paying in goods they need: knives, hatchets, salt, flour, tea, tobacco. Today, An indigenous group arrives at the trading post. They've traveled by river, their canoes loaded with furs. This is their tribute payment. They also have additional furs to trade. The imperial representative meets with their elder to assess the tribute. There's negotiation, though the power imbalance is clear. The empire has military force behind its demands. But smart administrators know not to push too hard, demand too much, and people flee deeper into the forest, beyond reach. Fair treatment, relatively speaking, keeps the tribute flowing. After official business, the indigenous peoples trade their additional furs for goods they want. The trader spreads out his merchandise, steel knives far superior to anything they can make themselves, hatchets, copper kettles, cloth, beads, tobacco. The negotiations are conducted partly in Russian, partly in the indigenous language, partly through gestures and established customs. Both sides know roughly what furs are worth, what trade goods cost. Deals are struck. The indigenous peoples load their canoes with trade goods and depart downriver. The trader returns to his warehouse to add the new furs to his stock. In another month, before the river freezes, a boat will arrive from downstream. It will carry manufactured goods up and take furs down. Those furs will travel eventually to markets hundreds or thousands of miles away, where they'll sell for prices that would astonish the trappers who caught the animals. The trader will profit from the difference between what he paid and what the furs sell for, minus transportation costs. It's a hard life on the frontier, but it can be profitable. Afternoon brings unexpected excitement. A trapper stumbles into the trading post, half frozen. He'd been working far upriver and got caught in an early snowstorm. 2 of his companions are dead, frozen. He barely survived. The trading post community springs into action. He's brought to the fire, given hot tea, wrapped in blankets. His frostbitten fingers might not all be saved. This is the reality of frontier life. Fortunes can be made in furs, but death is always close in the Siberian wilderness. By evening, the trading post settles into routine. The garrison soldiers change guard. The administrator works on his records by candlelight, noting the tribute received and the trade conducted. The trader shares dinner with several other families in the communal hall. Moose meat that hunters brought in, preserved vegetables, bread. Conversation is rough but friendly. Stories about the season's hunting, speculation about whether the winter will be severe, gossip about people at the next trading post upriver. The trader's life is isolated but connected to vast networks. The furs he's accumulating will travel down the river system, be transported across the steppes, and eventually reach markets in cities he's never seen and can barely imagine. Goods he sells here were manufactured in workshops thousands of miles away. He's a tiny piece of the empire's economic network, but an essential piece. Without trading posts like this, the empire couldn't access Siberian furs. Without the empire's infrastructure, he couldn't get the goods that indigenous peoples want in exchange for furs. These 4 snapshots, merchant in the capital, herder on the steppes, farmer in a Chinese village, trader on the Siberian frontier, show the extraordinary diversity of daily life across our hypothetical Tartarian Empire. The capital merchant and the frontier trader both participate in commerce, but their worlds are vastly different. The steppe herder and the Chinese farmer both work with animals and land, but their lifestyles share almost nothing. Yet all are subjects of the same Khan, all part of the same economic network, all connected by trade routes and administrative systems and military power that holds the empire together. What they share are certain commonalities. The empire's authority reaches all of them, whether through tax collectors, military recruiters, or administrators. Trade networks connect them, even if indirectly. The furs from Siberia might eventually line a coat worn by a merchant in the capital. The horses from the Mongolian steppes might be ridden by soldiers protecting the Chinese farmer's village. Cultural elements spread along these networks, tea from China becoming popular across the empire, Persian architectural influences reaching far beyond Persia's borders, stories and legends traveling with merchants and soldiers. But mostly, they're living their own lives, focused on immediate concerns. The merchant worries about the profitability of his investments. The herder worries about his animals surviving winter. The farmer worries about next year's harvest. The trader worries about making it through another Siberian winter. The empire is the backdrop to their lives, not the main focus. It provides security, infrastructure, and connections to larger markets. In return, it takes taxes and tribute. As long as this bargain remains acceptable, as long as what the empire takes doesn't exceed what it provides, ordinary people will accept its authority. This is what empire looks like from the ground level. Not grand strategies and historic battles, but daily life in all its variety, countless individuals pursuing their own goals within the framework the empire provides. Chapter 8. Relations with neighboring powers. No empire exists in isolation. Our hypothetical Tartarian Empire, despite its enormous size, would be surrounded by other powerful states, ambitious kingdoms, and rival civilizations. How it managed these relationships would be crucial to its survival and would shape its character over centuries. Let's explore the complex web of diplomacy, trade, conflict, and cultural exchange that would define the empire's foreign relations. To the east and southeast, China would be the most important neighbor, though the relationship would depend on whether our Tartarian Empire controlled parts of China or whether China remained independent. Let's imagine a scenario where the empire controls northern China, but southern China remains under the Ming dynasty, creating a border along the Yangtze River or somewhere in that general region. This would create a fascinating dynamic. The two states would share enormous cultural and economic ties, but also fundamental tensions. The Ming would view the Tartarian control of northern China as foreign occupation of traditionally Chinese lands. They would see themselves as the legitimate heirs of Chinese civilization, temporarily denied control of the north. The Tartarian Empire, meanwhile, would see itself as the rightful ruler of the territories it controlled, with a governing system that combined Mongol military tradition with Chinese administrative expertise. Despite these tensions, the border would likely be relatively stable for long periods. Both sides would recognize that large-scale war was expensive and risky. Trade would flow across the border, goods from southern China traveling north, products from across the Tartarian Empire traveling south. There might even be a tributary relationship, though ambiguous. The Ming might occasionally send tribute missions to the Tartarian Khan, acknowledging his power while not truly accepting his authority. The Khan might accept these missions as submission, while the Ming treated them as diplomatic courtesy. This kind of deliberate ambiguity helped maintain peace. Cultural exchange would be constant despite political separation. Chinese scholars might serve in the Tartarian administration, bringing Confucian ideas of governance. Tartarian nobles might appreciate Chinese art, poetry, and luxury goods. Chinese refugees fleeing high taxes or war in the south might migrate north. Northern Chinese merchants would trade south, returning with silk and tea. The border would be porous for culture, even when politically it was a firm line. Militarily, both sides would maintain substantial forces along the border. The Great Wall, that ancient fortification system, would mark some of this frontier. The Tartarian side might station cavalry forces ready to respond to incursions. The Ming would have garrisons in border towns. Periodic skirmishes would occur, a border dispute here, raiders crossing the line there, but full-scale war would be rare because both sides had too much to lose. Looking west, the relationship with Persia would be complex. In our timeline, Persia is part of the Tartarian Empire, but it's far from the center of power and has its own strong cultural identity. The Safavid dynasty, which historically ruled Persia in the 16 and 1700s, wouldn't exist in our timeline. Instead, Persia would be administered as an imperial province with significant autonomy. The relationship with the broader Islamic world beyond Persia would matter greatly. The Ottoman Empire, rising to power in the 14 and 1500s, would be a natural rival, but also a potential ally. Both empires would be predominantly Muslim, at least in certain regions. Both would compete for influence in the Middle East and the Caucasus region. But both would also face common challenges: European expansion, managing diverse populations, maintaining trade routes. Diplomatic relations between the Tartarian and Ottoman empires might involve formal embassies, marriage alliances between ruling families, and carefully negotiated trade agreements. Ottoman merchants would want access to Silk Road goods. Tartarian merchants would want access to Mediterranean markets. Both empires would want to prevent the other from becoming too dominant. This would create a relationship that mixed cooperation and competition in roughly equal measure. Religious connections would complicate these relationships. The Ottoman Sultan claimed the title of Caliph, religious leader of Sunni Islam. How would Muslims in the Tartarian Empire view this? If the Tartarian Khan converted to Islam, as many Mongol rulers did, would he compete for Islamic legitimacy with the Ottomans? Or would there be an arrangement where the Ottoman Sultan held spiritual authority while the Tartarian Khan held temporal power in his territories? These questions don't have simple answers, and the relationship would likely shift over time depending on the personalities of particular rulers and the political circumstances. To the west and northwest, Russia would be the most dynamic and ultimately the most dangerous neighbor. In the early centuries of our timeline, Russian principalities would be weak, divided, and paying tribute to the western portions of the Tartarian Empire. But Russian power would grow steadily. The Grand Duchy of Moscow would consolidate control over other Russian principalities. Russian forces would become more effective, adopting firearms and new military techniques. The relationship would gradually shift from Russian subordination to competition to Russian dominance. This transition might take 2 centuries or more, but it would be inexorable. Russian expansion eastward was driven by multiple factors in actual history: desire for land, search for furs, religious mission to spread Orthodox Christianity, and simple momentum as success bred more expansion. All these factors would operate in our alternative timeline. Initially, the Tartarian Empire would be clearly dominant. Russian princes would come to the Khan's court to receive patents confirming their rule. They'd pay annual tribute. They'd provide troops when the Khan demanded. But slowly, the balance would shift. Russian territory would expand north and east into areas the Tartarian Empire controlled loosely, if at all. Russian military technology would improve. Russian population would grow while the steppe people's population remained relatively stable. By the 1600s, Russia and the Tartarian Empire would be roughly equal powers, competing for control of the vast Siberian territories. Russian Cossacks, those semi-independent warrior communities on Russia's frontiers, would push eastward, establishing forts and trading posts. The Tartarian Empire would resist, but controlling Siberia's enormous distances was difficult. By the 1700s, Russia would be winning this competition, systematically absorbing territories that had been Tartarian. Cultural exchange between Russians and the Tartarian peoples would be significant. Russians and Tatars lived side by side in many border regions. Intermarriage occurred. Cultural practices blended. Russian vocabulary absorbed Turkic and Mongol words. Russian military tactics were influenced by steppe cavalry traditions. Meanwhile, Russians in areas under Tartarian control would maintain their Orthodox Christianity and distinct identity, creating communities that were culturally Russian but politically Tartarian. To the south, India represented a different kind of relationship. The Hindu Kush Mountains and the Himalayas created a formidable natural barrier between the Tartarian Empire and the Indian subcontinent. But trade routes crossed these mountains at certain passes, creating economic connections. In the early centuries of our timeline, India would be fragmented into numerous kingdoms and sultanates. By the 1600s, the Mughal Empire would be rising to dominate much of India. The Mughals were themselves descended from Central Asian peoples. Timur and Genghis Khan both appear in Mughal royal genealogies. This shared heritage might create some diplomatic affinity between the Tartarian and Mughal empires. Trade would be the primary connection. Indian spices, textiles, and precious stones would travel north through mountain passes, exchanged for horses, furs, and Central Asian products. Indian merchants would establish communities in Central Asian cities. Central Asian merchants would have representatives in Indian trading centers. Cultural exchange would follow trade. Indian mathematical and astronomical knowledge spreading north. Central Asian artistic styles influencing northern Indian courts. Military conflicts would be limited by geography. The mountain barriers made large-scale invasions difficult in either direction. There might be competition for control of key passes and the borderland regions of Kashmir and Afghanistan, but neither empire would seriously threaten the other's heartland. Further south and east, contact with Southeast Asian kingdoms would be limited but present if the Tartarian Empire controlled Pacific coastlines. Maritime trade with the islands of what we now call Indonesia, the Philippines, and mainland Southeast Asia would bring spices, tropical products, and exotic goods northward. Chinese merchants often dominated these trade routes historically, and they would continue to do so, But now they'd be operating under Tartarian authority if the empire controlled Chinese ports. Japan would be an interesting case. The Japanese had traumatic memories of the Mongol invasion attempts in the late 1200s, when Kublai Khan sent fleets to conquer Japan. Those invasions failed, partly due to storms that destroyed much of the Mongol fleet, storms the Japanese called kamikaze, or divine wind. In our timeline, would there be renewed attempts to invade Japan, or would the Tartarian Empire learn from past failures and focus on trade instead? Probably the latter. Japan had little that justified the enormous expense of a maritime invasion across dangerous seas. Trade would be more profitable. Japanese silver and copper were valuable. Japanese crafts, swords, ceramics, lacquerware, were highly prized. Peaceful trade would serve both sides better than war. So we'd likely see Japanese merchants trading at Tartarian ports, carefully regulated but profitable. Cultural exchange would be limited but real. Some Japanese might study in Chinese cities under Tartarian control. Some Tartarian goods would appear in Japanese markets. Korea would be a more complicated neighbor. The Korean peninsula had historically been in China's sphere of influence, sending tribute to Chinese emperors. With China divided in our timeline, would Korea send tribute to the Ming in southern China or to the Tartarian Khan controlling northern China? Probably they'd try to play both sides, sending token tribute to both while maximizing their own independence. Korean security concerns would focus primarily on preventing invasion from the north. They'd maintain substantial military forces and would likely pay close attention to any signs of Tartarian military build-up near their border. But if the Tartarian Empire maintained stable, non-aggressive policies toward Korea, the relationship could be peaceful for long periods. Trade would flow, cultural exchange would continue. Korea was heavily influenced by Chinese culture and would maintain those ties even when China was politically divided. The European powers would be distant but increasingly important over the centuries of our timeline. In the 1300s and 1400s, Europeans had limited knowledge of Central Asia and essentially no direct political relations with powers there. But European interest would grow, driven initially by trade desires and later by colonial ambitions. By the 1500s, European ships were finding routes around Africa to reach Asia directly. This maritime trade would gradually undermine the Silk Road, reducing the Tartarian Empire's ability to tax overland trade. European merchants, Portuguese, then Dutch, and English, would establish trading posts in Asian ports. If the Tartarian Empire controlled Pacific coastlines, there might be direct European-Tartarian trade relationships. By the 1700s and 1800s, European military technology would be advancing rapidly. European powers would be colonizing or dominating much of the world. The Tartarian Empire would face a new kind of challenge, not from traditional rivals like China or Persia, but from technologically advanced powers arriving by sea. How would a steppe empire, built on cavalry and overland trade, adapt to a world where naval power and firearms were becoming dominant? This would be a crucial test. The Ottoman Empire faced similar challenges historically and survived for centuries through a combination of selective adoption of European military technology, playing European powers against each other diplomatically, and maintaining internal cohesion despite external pressures. Our Tartarian Empire might follow a similar path, adopting firearms and cannons, hiring European military advisors, but struggling to fundamentally transform a society built around very different military and economic foundations. The Great Game, the competition between the British Empire expanding from India and the Russian Empire expanding eastward, both seeking control of Central Asia, would directly threaten the Tartarian Empire in its later, weaker period. In actual history, this competition in the 1800s led to Russian conquest of Central Asia and British control of Afghanistan. In our timeline, the Tartarian Empire would be caught between these two expanding powers, probably unable to resist both simultaneously. Diplomatic marriages would be a tool for managing all these relationships. Royal families would intermarry strategically. A Tartarian princess might marry a Chinese prince to cement a peace treaty, or a Tartarian Khan might marry a Persian noble's daughter to strengthen ties with that region. These marriages created personal connections between ruling families and sometimes diffused tensions. A ruler might be less likely to attack his son-in-law's territory or to pursue policies that would harm his daughter's adopted homeland. Tribute systems would be another diplomatic tool. though one that could be ambiguous. When a weaker power sent tribute to a stronger one, what did that mean exactly? Formal submission, recognition of superiority, or just a trade relationship dressed up in ceremonial language? Different parties might understand the same tributary relationship differently, and that ambiguity could be diplomatically useful. Treaties would be negotiated when necessary. Border agreements defining where one empire's territory ended and another's began. Trade agreements specifying tariffs, regulations, and dispute resolution mechanisms. Military alliances against common threats. These treaties would be elaborate documents, negotiated by professional diplomats, often written in multiple languages to ensure both sides understood the terms the same way. But treaties were only as good as the power to enforce them. When empires were strong and roughly balanced in power, treaties tended to be respected. When one side became much stronger, treaties might be ignored or reinterpreted. The Tartarian Empire's diplomatic history would include both periods of stable treaty relationships and periods of conflict when agreements broke down. Cultural prestige mattered in these relationships. An empire that was seen as civilized, as a center of learning and arts, commanded more respect than one seen as barbarian. The Tartarian Empire would need to cultivate this prestige, supporting scholars, building magnificent architecture, producing art and literature that impressed foreign visitors. Ambassadors from other courts would report back about what they saw, and those reports would shape how others viewed the empire. Religion could be both a bond and a source of conflict. Shared Islamic faith might create some sense of solidarity between the Tartarian Empire, the Ottomans, and various Persian and Central Asian powers. But religious differences could also cause problems. Tensions between Sunni and Shia Muslims, between Muslims and Buddhists, between any organized religion and traditional shamanic practices. The empire would need to navigate these religious complexities in both internal governance and foreign relations. Standing in the Khan's court during a diplomatic reception, you'd see this web of international relationships made visible. Ambassadors from China in their silk robes, Persian envoys in elaborate turbans, Russian princes in fur-trimmed cloaks, Ottoman representatives with messages from the Sultan, perhaps even a European trader or Jesuit missionary seeking audience. Each interaction would be carefully choreographed. Who stood where? Who spoke first? What gifts were exchanged? What language was used? These ceremonies reinforced hierarchies and relationships, reminding everyone of their place in the international order. But, away from ceremonies, in private meetings where real decisions were made, the calculations would be cold and practical. Which neighbors were growing stronger and needed to be watched? Where were opportunities for expansion? What alliances would serve the empire's interests? How could the empire play rivals against each other? These were the questions that would occupy the Khan's advisors and shape policy for decades. The empire's foreign relations would evolve over the centuries. In its early period, it would be dominant, and neighbors would defer to its power. In its middle period, it would face rough equality with several major powers and would need sophisticated diplomacy to maintain its position. In its later period, as the empire weakened, it would be increasingly on the defensive, trying to play stronger powers against each other to preserve what independence it could. This cycle, rise, peak, decline, is common to empires throughout history. What makes each empire's story unique is the specific challenges it faced and how it responded to them. Our Tartarian Empire's challenge would be maintaining unity across enormous distances and tremendous diversity, while facing neighbors who were themselves growing stronger, and while the very foundations of military and economic power were shifting in ways that favored settled, maritime, gunpowder-based empires over cavalry-based steppe powers. These external pressures, combined with internal tensions we'll explore in the next section, would eventually prove too much for the empire to withstand. But for centuries, skilled diplomacy, military strength, and economic prosperity would allow the empire to navigate these complex international relationships successfully. Chapter 9. The Decline and Fall. Every empire, no matter how powerful at its height, eventually faces decline. For our hypothetical Tartarian Empire, the fall wouldn't come suddenly, no single catastrophic defeat or moment of collapse. Instead, it would be a gradual process spanning 2 to 3 centuries, as internal weaknesses and external pressures slowly overwhelmed the forces holding the empire together. Let's trace this long decline from its first signs to its final dissolution. The seeds of decline would be planted even during the empire's height in the 1500s. Success itself created problems. The empire had grown so vast that governing it effectively strained even the most sophisticated administrative systems. A message from the capital to the eastern frontier might take 2 months. By the time a response returned, circumstances could have changed completely. Regional governors, out of necessity, made decisions without waiting for central approval. This was practical, but it also meant power was inevitably devolving away from the center. The succession system, even if it had been reformed to prevent the worst civil wars, would face increasing strain over generations. As the royal family expanded, more princes had plausible claims to power. The council system that might have prevented succession crises in earlier generations became a forum for factional competition. Different branches of the family accumulated their own supporters, their own power bases, their own regional interests. When a great Khan died, even with established succession rules, there would be maneuvering, deal-making, and sometimes violence before the next Khan was firmly established. Consider what might happen around the year 1600. The reigning Khan dies after a long reign. He has designated his eldest son as successor, following the established primogeniture system. But the eldest son is widely seen as weak, more interested in poetry and religious contemplation than in governing. A younger brother, a successful military commander with loyal troops, believes he would make a better Khan. Regional governors take sides. Some support the legitimate heir, either from principle or because they've made deals securing their positions under his rule. Others support the military brother, believing strong leadership is needed or hoping for rewards if he succeeds. The empire teeters on the edge of civil war. Armies mobilize. But neither side is confident of victory, and both fear the damage war would cause. After months of tense negotiation, a compromise is reached. The elder brother becomes Khan, but the military brother becomes supreme military commander with enormous autonomy. Power is effectively shared, though this creates an awkward dual authority that causes confusion and conflict over policy. This kind of compromise succession would work in the short term, but weaken the empire long term. Clear authority would be diluted. Regional governors would learn they could play different factions against each other, increasing their own autonomy. The precedent of compromise would make future successions even more contentious, as ambitious princes realized the throne could be contested successfully. Economic pressures would mount during the 1600s. The maritime trade routes that European ships pioneered around Africa meant goods could flow from Asia to Europe by sea, bypassing the Silk Road entirely. A merchant in Lisbon could now purchase silk and spices from ships that had sailed directly from Asian ports. They didn't need to deal with the overland caravan trade that the Tartarian Empire taxed and controlled. At first, this wouldn't devastate the empire's economy. Overland trade continued. It was often faster than sailing around an entire continent, and some goods moved more efficiently overland. Internal trade within the empire remained substantial, but the trend was clear and irreversible. The economic foundation that had made the empire wealthy was eroding. Tax revenues from trade declined. This meant less money for the military, for administration, for the infrastructure that held the empire together. Agricultural production remained stable, even increased in some regions as new lands were brought under cultivation. But this created its own problems. As populations grew, pressure on resources increased. In marginal lands, overgrazing by herds could lead to desertification, destroying pastures that had sustained nomadic peoples for millennia. In agricultural regions, intensive farming without adequate fallowing could deplete soil. These environmental challenges wouldn't cause immediate crisis, but would gradually reduce the empire's ability to support its population. Corruption would grow as the empire aged. This is almost inevitable in large bureaucracies over time. Officials appointed to positions would use them for personal enrichment. Tax collectors would skim percentages for themselves. Regional governors would underreport revenues, keeping the difference. Contracts for military supplies would go to relatives of officials at inflated prices. None of this was unique to the Tartarian Empire. Every large state in history has faced corruption. But the scale of the problem would grow, siphoning away resources needed for legitimate imperial functions. Military challenges would intensify dramatically during the 16 and 1700s. The revolution in military technology meant cavalry, the empire's traditional strength, was becoming less dominant. A well-trained infantry unit with muskets could stop cavalry charges that would have been unstoppable 2 centuries earlier. Artillery was becoming more mobile and more devastating. Fortifications designed to resist traditional siege weapons could be reduced by cannon fire in days rather than months. The empire would try to adapt. Chinese workshops could manufacture firearms. European mercenaries or advisors might be hired to train troops in new techniques. Some Mongol and Turkic warriors would learn to fight with guns as well as bows. But this was a difficult transition. The whole social structure of the steppe peoples was built around horsemanship and archery, skills learned from childhood. Firearms required different training and created different dynamics in battle. An army of mounted archers was primarily aristocratic, warriors who could afford horses and equipment. An infantry army with muskets could draw from broader social classes, changing military service from an aristocratic privilege to a more general obligation or profession. This military revolution favored settled states with large populations, industrial capacity to manufacture weapons, and tax systems that could fund standing armies of infantry. It favored naval powers that could project force across oceans. All of these factors worked against an empire built on nomadic cavalry traditions and overland trade routes. External pressures would become overwhelming during the 1700s. Russia, now the Russian Empire, under Tsars like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, would be systematically expanding eastward. Russian armies, equipped with modern firearms and artillery, trained by European standards, and backed by a growing industrial base, would be more than a match for Tartarian forces. The conquest of Siberia, already begun by Russian Cossacks in the late 1500s, would accelerate. Trading posts would become forts. Forts would become towns. Russian settlers would follow, creating facts on the ground that military force alone couldn't reverse. The Tartarian Empire would resist, but the trends were against it. Battles might be won, but the strategic situation would continue deteriorating. Territory would be lost piece by piece. First the westernmost regions, then progressively eastward. By mid-1700s, Russian control would extend to the Pacific, cutting the empire off from northern territories that had provided valuable furs. To the east, the Qing dynasty in China would be expanding westward. The Qing, themselves originally from Manchuria, and thus understanding steppe peoples, would be formidable opponents. They had adopted Chinese organizational capacity while maintaining martial traditions. Qing armies would systematically conquer Mongolia in stages through the late 16 and early 1700s. This was the heartland, the ancestral territory of the Mongols. Its loss would be psychologically devastating beyond its economic or strategic value. The Qing would also push into Xinjiang, that western region of deserts and oases that was part of the Silk Road network. By the mid-1700s, Qing control would extend to territories that had been Tartarian for centuries. The empire would be squeezed from both east and west, losing territory to expanding neighbors that had larger populations, superior technology, and momentum on their side. Internal fragmentation would accelerate as external territories were lost. Regional governors, seeing the center weakening, would begin acting as independent rulers. In Central Asia, the great cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, Khiva, might come under the control of local dynasties only nominally loyal to the Great Khan. They'd still claim to be part of the empire, still acknowledge the Khan's theoretical authority, but in practice, they'd make their own decisions, keep their own taxes, and pursue their own foreign policies. Persia, if it had remained under Tartarian control, might break away entirely or fall under Ottoman or Safavid Persian influence. The western territories might fragment into numerous small khanates, each claiming descent from Genghis Khan, each insisting they were the true heirs, none strong enough to actually reunite the territories. Religious tensions might intensify during this period of weakness. When the empire was strong, pragmatic tolerance worked because central authority could suppress conflicts. As central authority weakened, local conflicts that had been suppressed might flare up. Muslims and Buddhists, who had coexisted peacefully under imperial rule, might come into conflict when competing for resources or influence with local rulers. These religious conflicts wouldn't cause the empire's fall, but they'd be symptoms of the breakdown of central authority. Economic crisis would compound military and political problems. With trade revenues declining, territory being lost, and corruption eating away at what remained, the imperial treasury would face chronic shortfalls. There wouldn't be enough money to pay the military adequately, leading to desertion and mutinies. Infrastructure would decay, roads not maintained, bridges not repaired, the Yam postal stations abandoned. As infrastructure decayed, trade became more difficult and dangerous, further reducing revenue in a downward spiral. Debasement of currency might be attempted as a desperate measure to raise revenue. The Khan's mints would reduce the precious metal content in coins while maintaining face value. This would create inflation, harming everyone with savings while providing only temporary relief to the government. Merchants would lose confidence in imperial currency and might revert to barter or insist on payment in foreign currency, further undermining economic stability. Consider the empire's situation around the year 1750. The Great Khan still sits in the capital, still receives embassies, still claims authority over vast territories. But the reality would be hollow. Russian control extends through most of Siberia. The Qing control Mongolia and Xinjiang. Central Asian Khanates are independent in all but name. The empire's effective territory might be reduced to a fraction of what it had been at its height 2 centuries earlier. Revenue is a shadow of what it once was. The military is underfunded and demoralized. The elaborate court ceremonies continue, but they're increasingly empty rituals. The Great Game, the competition between the British Empire expanding from India and the Russian Empire expanding eastward, would be the final blow to what remained of the Tartarian Empire. Through the late 1700s and early 1800s, these two great powers would compete for control of Central Asia. The independent Khanates that had once been part of the Tartarian Empire would try to play the British and Russians against each other, preserving their independence by making neither power feel secure enough to take aggressive action. But this balancing act couldn't last indefinitely. Russia, geographically closer and with established presence in the region, would move first. Through the mid-1800s, Russian forces would systematically conquer the Central Asian Khanates. Kokand would fall, then Bukhara, then Khiva. The process would mix military conquest with diplomacy. Some Khanates would become Russian protectorates, maintaining nominal independence while accepting Russian control of foreign policy and military affairs. Others would be annexed outright, becoming provinces of the Russian Empire. The British, focused on India and concerned about Russian expansion toward their territories, would compete in Afghanistan and Persia, but ultimately accept Russian dominance in most of Central Asia as long as it didn't directly threaten India. By the late 1800s, the Great Game would result in a rough partition, Russia controlling Central Asia and most of the territories that had been Tartarian, Britain dominating Afghanistan and approaches to India, with Persia as a contested buffer zone. The final Khan might reign over little more than the capital city and its immediate surroundings. He might still claim the titles, still insist he was heir to Genghis Khan, still maintain court ceremonies. But everyone would know these were empty forms. Perhaps in 1870 or 1880, Russian forces would arrive at the capital. There might not even be a battle. What could the Khan's small, poorly equipped forces do against a modern Russian army? A treaty would be signed. The Khan might be allowed to keep his title and even a pension, living in comfortable captivity. Or he might flee into exile, ending his days in some distant city, a curiosity from another age. The empire would be formally dissolved, its last territories divided between Russia, China, and whatever other powers had claims. Why would so little physical trace remain of an empire that lasted 5 centuries and controlled half of Asia? Several reasons, all perfectly ordinary and requiring no conspiracy theories. First, much architecture would have been wood or other impermanent materials. The nomadic tradition favored structures that could be moved or rebuilt, not stone monuments meant to last millennia. Even elaborate wooden palaces would decay within a few centuries if not constantly maintained. After the empire fell, successor states wouldn't maintain Tartarian buildings. They'd build their own, often reusing materials from older structures. Second, conquering powers often deliberately destroyed monuments of previous empires. Russian and Chinese expansion would have involved suppressing Tartarian identity, which might include destroying symbols of past glory. Not everywhere, not systematically, but enough that many structures wouldn't survive. Third, the climate and environment would take their toll. Central Asian deserts had sandstorms that could bury or erode buildings. Siberian winters would destroy structures, not constantly maintained. Even in more temperate regions, centuries of weather would wear down stone and completely destroy wood. Fourth, wars and upheavals would damage or destroy many structures. The civil wars and conflicts during the empire's decline, the conquests by Russia and China, later revolutions and wars in the region, all would have destroyed buildings. A palace that survived 4 centuries might be destroyed in a battle in year 401. Finally, modern ideological concerns would shape how successor states treated Tartarian heritage. Soviet historiography downplayed or distorted the history of non-Russian peoples in Central Asia. Chinese historiography emphasized Chinese civilization and minimized the achievements of non-Han peoples. This wouldn't be a conspiracy to hide Tartarian history, but rather the normal tendency of nations to emphasize narratives that support their legitimacy and minimize ones that don't. What would remain? Archaeological sites waiting to be properly excavated and studied. Foundation stones of buildings long gone. Sections of roads still visible from satellite imagery. Ruins of caravanserais along old trade routes. Fragments of pottery, coins bearing Khan's names, pieces of tilework from mosques and palaces. Written records, histories written during the empire or shortly after. Administrative documents preserved in archives, accounts by foreign travelers. Genetic traces in populations across Eurasia. Linguistic influences in regional languages. Cultural practices and traditions that survived in modified forms. An archaeologist or historian studying the region in modern times would be able to piece together that a significant empire existed here. The evidence wouldn't be as overwhelming as, say, Roman remains in Europe, because the Tartarian Empire built less in permanent materials and existed in regions where preservation is difficult. But it wouldn't be mysterious or hidden, just requiring careful study to understand. Looking back on this long decline from our vantage point, we can see it was almost inevitable. The very factors that allowed the Mongols to build such a vast empire, mobility, military superiority, control of trade routes, were becoming less important as the world changed. Settled states with industrial economies and modern military technology were the future. Naval powers that could trade by sea were the future. Steppe cavalry empires, no matter how sophisticated their administration, were the past. The Tartarian Empire's 5 centuries would have been a remarkable achievement. Many empires lasted far less. The ability to maintain unity across such vast distances and diversity for that long would have required constant adaptation, skilled leadership, and favorable circumstances. But ultimately, no empire lasts forever. The forces of change, technological, economic, military, political, eventually overwhelm even the strongest structures humans create. The empire's legacy would persist in countless ways even after political unity ended. The cultural synthesis it fostered would continue influencing art, architecture, and literature. The trade networks it maintained would shape economic patterns for generations. The mixing of peoples it enabled would leave genetic and cultural traces. The administrative techniques it developed would be adopted by successor states. The memory of unity would inspire later movements and ideologies, whether or not they accurately understood what the empire had really been. From its consolidation around 1300 to its final dissolution around 1880, roughly 580 years of existence as a unified empire, though the last century or more would be decline rather than genuine unity. A remarkable span for any human institution, a significant chapter in world history, and a fascinating example of how geography, culture, military power, and economic systems interact to create and eventually destroy empires. Chapter 10. Legacy and Separating Fact from Fiction. As we approach the end of our journey through this alternative history, it's time to step back and carefully distinguish between what actually existed, what might have existed under different circumstances, and what definitely did not exist. This is crucial because the real history of Central Asia, the Mongol Empire, and the peoples these regions are fascinating enough without needing embellishment or mystery. Let's start with what we know for certain from actual history. The term Tartaria appeared on European maps from the 1500s through the 1800s. This is documented, verifiable fact. You can go to libraries and archives today and see these maps. The cartographers who made them, Ortelius, Vischer, and many others, were real people whose lives and work are well documented. The territories these maps labeled as Tartaria were also real. The vast steppes of Central Asia, the Siberian forests, the great cities of the Silk Road, the Mongolian plateau, all of these places existed and were inhabited by real peoples with rich cultures and histories. The Mongols, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Tatars, and dozens of other ethnic groups who lived in these regions weren't mysterious or unknown. They had their own historical records, their own traditions, their own accounts of their lives and societies. The Mongol Empire was real and was the largest contiguous land empire in history. Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes in 1206 and launched conquests that reshaped Eurasia. His empire at its height controlled territory from Korea to Eastern Europe. This isn't disputed or mysterious. It's well documented in sources from multiple civilizations, including Chinese, Persian, Russian, and European chronicles, written at the time or shortly after. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire after Genghis Khan's death is also historical fact. The empire split into the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Each of these successor states is documented in detail. We know who their rulers were, what wars they fought, what policies they implemented. Historians study them using primary sources, documents written during those periods. The various khanates that succeeded the Mongol Empire continued for centuries. The Kazan Khanate existed until Russian conquest in 1552. The Crimean Khanate lasted until the late 1700s. The Khanates of Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand existed into the 1800s before Russian conquest. All of these are thoroughly documented historical states, not mysteries. So the question becomes, why did European mapmakers label this entire region Tartaria when it was actually divided into numerous separate states? The answer is simple and not mysterious at all. Europeans had limited, fragmentary knowledge of Central Asia. They knew peoples called Tatars or Tartars lived in a vast region beyond their borders. They knew this region was hard to reach, dangerous to travel through, and controlled by peoples with formidable military traditions. So they used Tartaria as a catch-all term for territories they didn't understand in detail. This was a cartographic convenience, not evidence of a hidden empire. As European knowledge improved, as Russian expansion provided better information about Siberia, as trade contacts increased, as travelers brought back more detailed accounts, the maps became more accurate. By the mid-1800s, Tartaria was disappearing from maps, replaced by more specific labels reflecting actual political divisions. This progression from vague to specific is normal in the history of cartography. It happened with many regions as geographical knowledge improved. Now let's talk about our thought experiment, the hypothetical unified Tartarian Empire we've been exploring. This was explicitly labeled as alternative history, a what-if scenario. We imagined what might have happened if the Mongol Empire had maintained unity instead of fragmenting. We based this on real elements, real peoples, real geography, real technologies, real cultural traditions, but combined them in a way that didn't actually happen. If such an empire had really existed, what evidence would we expect to find today? Quite a lot, actually. There would be extensive written records, administrative documents, histories, literature produced during the empire. Even if many were lost, some would survive in archives. There would be archaeological remains, foundations of buildings, city sites, fortifications, industrial sites like mines and workshops. There would be coins bearing the names and images of Khans, distributed across the empire's territories. There would be clear genetic evidence. DNA studies would show patterns of population mixing consistent with a long unified empire. There would be linguistic evidence, extensive borrowing between languages, or perhaps a lingua franca that spread across the empire. There would be architectural remains. Even if most buildings were gone, foundations and some structures would survive, showing a consistent imperial style. Importantly, successor states would remember the empire. When empires fall, people don't immediately forget they existed. Rome fell in the West in 476, but medieval Europeans knew all about Roman history. They could see Roman buildings, read Roman texts, and understood themselves as heirs to Roman civilization. The Ottoman Empire fell in 1923, just over a century ago, and everyone knows it existed because the evidence is overwhelming. A Tartarian empire that lasted until the late 1800s would be remembered clearly by people alive in the early 1900s. There would be people whose grandparents remembered living under imperial rule. But here's the crucial point. We don't find this evidence because the unified Tartarian Empire didn't exist. What existed was a fragmented collection of khanates and tribal confederations, each with its own history, sometimes cooperating but often fighting each other. These states left their own historical traces, but the evidence points to fragmentation, not unity. This brings us to the modern conspiracy theories about Tartaria that have spread on the internet. These theories claim that a great Tartarian empire existed, was technologically advanced, and was somehow erased from history. Let's examine why these theories are wrong. The conspiracy theories often point to grand buildings from the late 1800s and early 1900s, ornate government buildings, World's Fair structures, train stations with elaborate architecture, and claim these were built by Tartarians, not by the societies we know built them. This is demonstrably false. These buildings are thoroughly documented. We have the architects' names. Daniel Burnham designed many World's Columbian Exposition buildings. We have construction photographs showing them being built. We have payroll records for workers. We have the receipts for materials. We have contemporary newspaper accounts describing their construction. The conspiracy theories rely on the claim that these records are all fabricated, that there's been a massive historical cover-up. But this makes no sense. Why would thousands of people across different countries, different languages, different political systems all cooperate to hide the same thing? How could such a conspiracy possibly work? And who benefits from hiding the existence of Tartaria? These questions have no satisfactory answers because the premise is false. The mud flood theory, often associated with Tartarian conspiracies, claims that buildings were buried by some catastrophic flood, which is why some old buildings have windows or doors below current ground level. The reality is much simpler. Ground levels in cities rise naturally over centuries. As roads are repaved, debris accumulates, and new construction happens on top of old. This is a well-understood archaeological phenomenon. In Rome, you can see ancient buildings now below current street level, not because of mysterious floods, but because of normal urban development over 2,000 years. The conspiracy theories also claim that Tartarian buildings were built with free energy technology or other advanced capabilities that have been lost. This ignores how building construction actually works. We understand how 19th century buildings were constructed because we have detailed records, because many architects and engineers wrote about their methods, and because the buildings themselves can be studied. There's nothing mysterious about them. They were built with steel frames, using steam-powered equipment, by workers whose wages are recorded in ledgers. So why do these conspiracy theories exist? Several reasons. First, there's a human tendency to find patterns and connections even where none exist. Seeing the word Tartaria on old maps and seeing impressive old buildings creates a desire to connect them, even without evidence. Second, there's appeal in the idea of lost civilizations with advanced technology. It's romantically attractive. Third, some people distrust mainstream history and institutions, so alternative histories that position them as having secret knowledge feel empowering. Fourth, and importantly, the internet allows these theories to spread rapidly among people who want to believe them, creating echo chambers where doubts are suppressed and confirming evidence, however weak, is amplified. This is a modern phenomenon made possible by social media, but the psychological impulses behind it are ancient. Here's what's worth appreciating about the real history, without needing to invoke mysterious lost civilizations. The Mongol Empire really was extraordinary, the largest contiguous land empire ever, built with technology available in the 1300s. The organizational genius required to coordinate military campaigns across thousands of miles, the postal system that carried messages faster than would be possible until the telegraph, the administrative systems that could govern populations, speaking dozens of languages. These were genuine achievements. The cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, really were magnificent centers of learning and culture. The architecture that survives today shows incredible skill and artistry. The scholars who worked in these cities made real contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and other sciences. The Silk Road really did connect civilizations across Eurasia, enabling trade and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. The various peoples who lived in the regions Europeans labeled Tartaria had rich, complex cultures worthy of study and respect. Mongol traditions of governance influenced Russian administration. Persian culture influenced the Islamic world and beyond. Chinese technology spread westward along trade routes. These cultural exchanges happened through real historical processes that we can trace through evidence. The decline and fall of these states, their eventual conquest by expanding Russian and Chinese empires, was a genuine historical tragedy for the peoples involved. Cultures were suppressed, languages declined, traditional ways of life were disrupted. This is real history with real human costs, and it deserves to be understood accurately rather than being obscured by conspiracy theories. What would our hypothetical unified Tartarian Empire's legacy have been if it had actually existed? It would have left clear traces in multiple areas. Genetic studies would show mixing of populations across Eurasia in patterns consistent with a unified empire. Languages across the region would share more vocabulary and grammatical structures. Architectural styles would show more consistency across the region. Historical records from neighboring civilizations, so China, Persia, Russia, Europe, would extensively discuss this powerful neighbor. The empire's fall would be remembered clearly, much as the fall of Rome or the Ottoman Empire is remembered. But even though this unified empire didn't exist, the thought experiment we've conducted has value. It helps us understand what did exist by contrasting it with what might have been. It shows us the challenges of governing vast, diverse territories. It illustrates how trade networks, military power, and administrative systems interact. It demonstrates how technological change can undermine even seemingly stable political structures. The difference between legitimate alternative history and pseudo-history is crucial. Alternative history asks what-if questions based on changing specific historical events while keeping everything else realistic. It's a tool for understanding history better by exploring contingencies. Pseudo-history, by contrast, makes claims about what actually happened that contradict established evidence. It asks us to disbelieve documented facts in favor of speculation. Our exploration of a hypothetical Tartarian empire has been alternative history. We've been clear it's speculative. We've based it on real historical elements, and we haven't claimed it actually existed. The Tartarian conspiracy theories are pseudo-history. They claim something existed despite lack of evidence and in contradiction to extensive documentation. The real history of Central Asia, of the Mongol Empire and its successors, of the peoples Europeans called Tartars, is available to anyone who wants to learn it. Academic historians study these topics using primary sources in multiple languages. Archaeological excavations continue to uncover new information. Genetic studies illuminate population movements and mixing. There's no cover-up, no hidden knowledge, just the normal process of historical research, which is ongoing and constantly refining our understanding. If you're fascinated by the mystery of Tartaria on old maps, that fascination can lead you to learn about actual Central Asian history, which is rich and complex and doesn't require any conspiracy theories to be interesting. The rise and fall of the Mongol Empire, the golden age of Islamic learning in Central Asian cities, the Silk Road trade networks, the clash between nomadic and settled civilizations, all of these are real historical topics that reward study. The human desire for mystery and wonder is understandable. We're drawn to the idea that there might be hidden knowledge, lost civilizations, secrets the mainstream doesn't want us to know. But the real world, studied carefully with attention to evidence, offers more than enough wonder without requiring us to invent mysteries where none exist. Standing at the end of our journey through this alternative history, we can appreciate both the thought experiment and the reality. The hypothetical Tartarian Empire we've imagined would have been remarkable, a fusion of cultures creating something unique, lasting centuries despite enormous challenges. But the actual history is remarkable too, the real Mongol Empire and its successor states, the real peoples and cultures of Central Asia, the real trade networks and cultural exchanges that shaped Eurasia for centuries. We don't need to choose between appreciation of history and imagination. We can enjoy exploring alternative histories while also respecting actual history. We can acknowledge the appeal of mysteries while also accepting that sometimes the truth is simply what the evidence indicates. And we can find wonder in reality without needing to embellish it with fiction. The maps that showed Tartaria were real maps made by real people trying to represent their understanding of the world. The territories they labeled were real places inhabited by real peoples. Those peoples had their own histories, their own achievements, their own stories. Those stories deserve to be told accurately, learned properly, and appreciated fully. That's the real legacy, not of a mysterious lost empire, but of the actual civilizations that rose and fell across those vast territories, leaving traces that historians and archaeologists continue to study and interpret today. Chapter 11. Closing. The Power of Historical Imagination. We've traveled a long road together tonight, from the mysterious labels on Renaissance maps to the rise and fall of an empire that existed only in imagination. We've walked through capitals that were never built, listened to conversations in markets that never existed, and witnessed the decline of a state that never ruled. Yet through it all, we've learned something real about history, about empires, about the human experience of building civilizations that aspire to permanence but ultimately prove temporary. Our hypothetical Tartarian Empire was built from genuine materials. The peoples we described were real: Mongols, Turks, Persians, Chinese, Russians, and dozens of others who actually lived in these territories. The cities we placed in our empire, Samarkand, Bukhara, Beijing, were real cities with real histories. The technologies we described, horse archery, Quanat irrigation, the Yam postal system, were real technologies that real people used. The challenges we explored, governing across vast distances, managing diversity, adapting to technological change, were real challenges that actual empires faced. What we did was take these real elements and arrange them differently, asking what might have happened if a few key decisions had gone another way. If the Mongol Empire had solved its succession problems, if unity had been maintained instead of fragmentation, if the vast territories Europeans labelled Tartaria on their maps had actually been united under a single authority for centuries. This is the essence of alternative history, not inventing fantasy, but exploring roads not taken. And what did we learn? We learned that even the most powerful empires face fundamental challenges. Distance creates autonomy, whether rulers want it or not. Diversity creates tensions, even with the best policies of tolerance. Economic foundations can shift, undermining prosperity. Military technology can change, obsoleting the very forces that built an empire. Succession is always vulnerable to dispute. External pressures from neighbors never stop. And time itself works against all human institutions, as each generation must renew the commitment that previous generations made. We also learned that empires, for all their power, are built by ordinary people living ordinary lives. The merchant worrying about his investment in a caravan, the herder trying to keep his animals alive through winter, the farmer hoping for good weather and reasonable taxes, the trader on a distant frontier, far from home, seeking his fortune. These individual stories, multiplied millions of times, are what actually constitute an empire. The grand strategies and great battles matter, but they matter because they affect whether the merchant prospers, whether the herder's children survive, whether the farmer can keep his land, whether the trader returns home wealthy or dies in the wilderness. The real history of Central Asia, the actual Mongol Empire and its successor states, the genuine peoples who lived in the territories Europeans called Tartaria, all of this deserves our attention and respect. The Mongol Empire that Genghis Khan built really was one of history's most remarkable achievements, connecting Eurasia in ways that wouldn't be matched until modern globalization. The cities of the Silk Road really were centers of learning and culture, where scholars from different traditions studied together. The various khanates that succeeded the Mongol Empire had their own stories of triumph and tragedy, achievement and decline. These real histories are available to anyone who wants to learn them. Academic libraries have books by historians who've spent careers studying these topics. Museums have artifacts from these civilizations. Archaeological sites continue to yield new discoveries. There's no conspiracy hiding this information, no cover-up making it inaccessible. It just requires the effort to learn, to read, to think critically about evidence. The conspiracy theories that claim a great Tartarian empire existed and was hidden from history do a disservice to actual history. They take peoples and cultures that really existed and replace their true stories with fantasies. They encourage distrust of historians and institutions without good reason. They lead people away from fascinating real history towards speculation that, while perhaps entertaining, teaches nothing true about the past. But the human impulses behind those conspiracy theories, the desire for mystery, the attraction to hidden knowledge, the appeal of lost civilizations, these are understandable. We're drawn to stories of vanished greatness, of secrets waiting to be uncovered. This is why we tell stories, why we imagine, why we wonder what if. The key is distinguishing between imagination acknowledged as imagination and claims presented as suppressed truth. Our exploration tonight has been clearly labeled as alternative history, as a thought experiment, as what if rather than what was. This is honest imagination. It takes real elements and recombines them to explore possibilities, but it doesn't claim these possibilities actually happened. It's a tool for understanding, not a substitute for evidence. There's value in imagining how things might have been different. It helps us understand why things happened the way they did. By imagining a unified Tartarian Empire, we better understand why the Mongol Empire actually fragmented. We see the challenges more clearly by considering how they might have been overcome. By imagining this empire's eventual decline, we understand better the forces that brought down other empires in history. By imagining daily life across vast territories, we appreciate the human reality behind the political structures. This kind of imaginative engagement with history can deepen our understanding if we keep it grounded in reality. But if we lose that grounding, if we start believing our imaginings are actual suppressed truths, then we've crossed from useful speculation into harmful delusion. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you can hold both ideas in mind. The wonder of imagination, the ability to envision an empire that spanned half of Asia, to walk through markets that never existed, to hear languages blending that never actually mixed in quite that way. And the respect for reality, the acknowledgement that actual history, studied through evidence, tells us what really happened, and that this real history is itself full of wonder without needing embellishment. The steppes are still there, stretching to distant horizons under enormous skies. The mountains still stand, snow-capped peaks that have watched countless human stories unfold below. The rivers still flow, carrying water as they have for millennia. The cities still exist, though changed by time. Samarkand still stands, its blue domes still catching the sun. The Silk Road routes can still be traced, though no caravans travel them now. The peoples still exist, descendants of those who built the Mongol Empire, adapted to new times and new circumstances, but carrying forward cultural memories and traditions. What has changed is not the land or the peoples fundamentally, but the political structures that organized them, the technologies they used, the beliefs they held about their place in the world. This is the nature of history: continuity and change intertwined, some things persisting across centuries, while others transform beyond recognition. An empire like the one we imagine tonight would have been a remarkable human achievement. 5 centuries of unity across such vast territories and tremendous diversity would have required wisdom, flexibility, military strength, economic prosperity, and no small amount of luck. That it didn't actually exist doesn't diminish the value of imagining it. That thought experiment has helped us understand what did exist, what might have existed, and why the distinction matters. As we close this journey, take with you not just the images of cities and steppes, not just the stories of merchants and herders, but the deeper understanding that history is contingent, that different decisions might have led to very different outcomes, but that what actually happened is knowable through evidence and study. Take curiosity about the real history of Central Asia, about the Mongol Empire, about the peoples and cultures that existed in the territories Europeans labelled Tartaria, and take skepticism toward claims that require us to disbelieve documented evidence in favour of appealing fantasies. The maps that showed Tartaria were made by real cartographers doing their best with limited information. The territories they labelled were real places. The peoples who lived there were real people with real lives, real achievements, real struggles. Their true stories are worth learning. They don't need to be embellished with claims of lost advanced civilizations or hidden empires. They're fascinating enough, tragic enough, inspiring enough, as they actually were. History is not a fixed thing that happened once and is now simply recorded. It's an ongoing conversation between the present and the past, constantly being reinterpreted as new evidence comes to light and new questions are asked. But that reinterpretation must be grounded in evidence, in careful study, in intellectual honesty. The alternative is not freedom but confusion, not revelation but delusion. So rest now, travelers through time and imagination. Let the images of our alternative past fade into dreams. The turquoise domes catching sunset light, the sound of thousands of hooves on the steppe, the smell of spices in covered bazaars, the feel of silk between your fingers. The call to prayer echoing across an ancient city, the endless forests where trappers pursued furs worth fortunes, the throne room where a Khan received ambassadors from across the known world. These images, though imaginary, were built from real materials and real possibilities. They honor the actual peoples and cultures they draw from by taking them seriously, by imagining what they might have built if circumstances had been slightly different. And when you wake, the real history will still be there, waiting to be learned, perhaps even more interesting than the alternative we imagined, because it actually happened, because real people lived it, because the evidence of it still exists in archives and archaeological sites and genetic patterns and cultural traditions that persist today. The past is gone but not lost. It speaks to us through evidence if we listen carefully. It teaches us if we study honestly. And it reminds us that human civilizations, no matter how powerful, are temporary. But the impulse to build, to create, to organize, to connect, to leave something meaningful behind, that impulse is permanent as long as humans exist. Good night, and thank you for joining this exploration of an empire between history and imagination, a Tartaria that existed on maps and might have existed in reality, a thought experiment that, while speculative, perhaps taught us something true about empires, about history, and about ourselves.